20 years of silence. 20 winters where his hands carved wood while the rain beat against the roof, reminding him of what he had lost. Matteo learned to live without her laughter, without her eyes that reflected the sky. Until a devastating storm brought to his door a girl with those same eyes, clutching a small wooden box that he himself had carved 2 decades earlier. Sometimes fate takes everything from us, only to return much more. If this story touches your heart, that place where we keep our own losses and hopes, gift us your like as one who lights a candle in the darkness, and tell us, how do you think this journey of reunion will end? Your story also deserves to be heard. The sky had broken into 1,000 pieces over Valle de las Rosas. It wasn't just any rain, but a furious deluge that punished the earth with ancestral violence. The streams, normally gentle, had transformed into savage beasts devouring roads and bridges. The village, now isolated by barricades of mud and fallen trunks, seemed to have disconnected from the world. Elena observed the fury of the water from the fogged window of her small hospital room. Her fingers, thin and pale like withered petals, traced invisible figures on the glass. The leaden sky reflected in her dark eyes deep as wells, where time seemed to have stopped. A nurse entered with soft steps, almost floating on the linoleum floor. "You should rest, Lara," whispered the woman, adjusting the IV drip that fed her veins with a transparent liquid. Elena didn't respond. Her thoughts were elsewhere, navigating between the raindrops, searching for her little one. Isabel was barely 8 years old, and the last image she had of her was her tiny silhouette running toward the barn when the river began to overflow, while she tried to save what little remained in their modest home. Afterward, everything turned to darkness. At the other end of the valley, where the hills began to rise and the pines whispered ancestral secrets, Matteo Suarez took refuge in the solidity of his wooden and stone cabin. 45 years had carved his face with the same precision with which he carved figures in wood. Each line, each furrow, told a story of chosen solitude and kept words. His hands, weathered by working with the earth and animals, held a cup of coffee while his eyes, the color of wet earth, contemplated the fury of the storm. The barn. He needed to check the barn. With a tired sigh, Matteo put on his worn raincoat and went out to face the downpour. The wind howled among the trees like a wounded animal, and the earth had transformed into a dark and treacherous sea. His boots sank into the mud as he advanced, leaning against the tempest toward the wooden structure that stood out, ghostly, about 50 meters from the house. The barn door was ajar, banging against the frame with an irregular rhythm. Matteo frowned. He was sure he had closed it. The interior smelled of damp hay, old wood, and something else, something that didn't belong there. A presence. In the gloom, a small bundle stirred next to the bales of hay. At first he thought it might be some animal seeking shelter, but as he approached, his heart gave a jolt inside his chest. A girl, drenched and trembling, with black hair stuck to her face and torn clothes, looked at him with enormous eyes, terrified yet defiant. Between her small hands, she clutched a carved wooden box as if it held the last vestiges of a vanished world. "Do you know my mum?" the little girl asked in a broken voice, barely audible above the roar of the storm. Time stopped in that instant. Matteo felt something ancient stir within him, as if a long-dormant seed awakened with the first drops of rain after a drought. There was something in that gaze, in the determination with which she held the box, in the dignified fragility of her posture that seemed painfully familiar. He removed his raincoat and placed it over the tiny shoulders. "I don't know, little one," he replied in a soft voice, different from the one he usually used, "but we can find out when the storm passes." The girl didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either when Matteo lifted her in his arms. Human contact, after so many years of avoiding it, felt strange, uncomfortable, and yet as necessary as air. As they walked back to the cabin, with the rain beating them mercilessly, Matteo felt that something was changing in the constant rhythm of his existence, as if the overflowing river had not only swept away bridges and roads, but also the invisible barriers he had built around his heart during so many years of voluntary silence. The storm continued to lash the valley for 3 more days. 3 days in which the outside world was suspended, as if all that mattered was contained within the walls of that cabin where a man accustomed to solitude tried to decipher the enigma of childish eyes that seemed to contain the wisdom of time. Isabel, that's what the girl said her name was, spoke little. Her words were like frightened birds that emerged in brief flights before returning to the refuge of silence. She slept fitfully, waking several times during the night with rapid breathing and eyes open in terror. In those moments, she hugged the wooden box to her chest as if it were a shield against invisible monsters. Matteo didn't ask questions. He knew too well the value of silence, the respect for inner spaces where each human being keeps their treasures and their monsters. He limited himself to placing a cup of hot chocolate on the table and sitting in front of the fireplace, carving small animal figures that he later left, like silent offerings, near where the girl rested. During the day, Isabel observed with curiosity Matteo's precise and measured movements, how he fed the animals that had survived the storm, how he repaired the damage to the barn roof, how his rough hands became surprisingly delicate when treating the wounds of a frightened colt. It was precisely with the animals where Isabel began to show herself differently. On the morning of the fourth day, when the rain had subsided, leaving behind a washed and brilliant sky, Matteo found her in the corral, next to Tormenta, a black-coated mare that had never allowed anyone to approach her. The girl stood still while the animal brought its huge head to the small face, as if they shared a secret language. "I've never seen Tormenta approach anyone like that," commented Matteo, keeping his distance so as not to break the spell. Isabel turned her head slightly. For the first time since her arrival, a shadow of a smile appeared on her lips. "My mum says that animals know who has a clean heart," she replied, in a voice so clear that it seemed impossible it was the same frightened girl from the barn. Matteo felt a strange tightness in his chest upon hearing the mention of the mother. Who could she be? Was she looking for the girl? Had she survived the devastation of the storm? "Your mother seems like a wise woman," he finally said. "She is," affirmed Isabel, and her eyes filled with an ancient sadness. "She gave me this box. She told me to always keep it, that it was important." Her small fingers caressed the carved surface of the box she carried everywhere. Matteo observed the intricate designs, flowers and birds intertwined in an eternal dance. There was something in that work that awakened dormant echoes in his memory, like a song heard so long ago that he no longer remembered the melody, only the feeling it evoked. "It's beautiful work," he commented, approaching slowly. "Whoever made it had special hands." Isabel nodded solemnly. "My mum said it was made by someone who loved her very much, someone who knew how to speak with wood." Something stirred in the depths of Matteo's gaze, but his face remained impassive. His fingers, however, tensed slightly, as if they had recognized something his mind had not yet processed. That night, while the girl slept, Matteo sat by the window, contemplating the valley that was beginning to emerge from chaos. The stars shone with an almost painful clarity after so many days of darkness. He thought about the carved box, the designs that seemed familiar, the hands that might have created it. 20 years ago he had carved dozens of similar boxes. It was the gift he offered to a young woman with deep eyes and easy laughter, the only person who had crossed the walls of his solitude. Elena Montero. A love that had blossomed among the valley's oaks during 2 perfect summers, before she disappeared without explanations, leaving behind only silence and unanswered questions. The coincidence was too great to ignore. Or perhaps, Matteo thought as sleep began to cloud his thoughts, it wasn't a coincidence at all, but the way destiny, patient as the roots of ancient trees, worked to reunite what should never have been separated. Morning arrived wrapped in fog, as if the entire valley exhaled the breath held during the storm. Isabel awoke with the song of birds returning cautiously to reclaim their territories. She found Matteo on the porch, motionless as one of his own sculptures, contemplating the diffuse horizon where the mountains merged with the sky. "The road should be passable now," he said without turning, perceiving her presence with that sensitivity developed by those who live in communion with nature. "Soon we'll be able to go to the village and look for your family." The girl didn't respond. She sat on the wooden step, hugging her knees. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but dense like the earth after rain, fertile with unspoken possibilities. "What if I don't find her?" she finally asked, in a voice so small it seemed to come from a place much deeper than her throat. Matteo turned then. His eyes, the exact color of ripe acorns, settled on the girl's face with an almost palpable intensity. "We'll find her," he affirmed, with a certainty he didn't feel. The road to the village was plagued with obstacles, fallen branches, treacherous puddles, small landslides. Matteo drove his old truck with the skill of someone who knows every curve, every stone in the road. Isabel sat beside him, clutching the wooden box, watching how the landscape transformed. Trees gave way to open fields, and these to small constructions that announced the proximity of the village. Valle de las Rosas seemed like a different place. The streets showed the wounds of the storm, damaged roofs, trees torn from their roots, crumbled walls. But there were also signs of recovery, neighbors working together to repair the damage, children playing in puddles, merchants reopening their shops. Life, obstinate and resilient, continued its course. In the main square, where an old oak had resisted the onslaught of the wind, a group of people gathered around an improvised bulletin board. Faces in photographs, names written in hurried letters, messages of search and reunion. The Wall of the Missing, they called it. Matteo parked the truck and helped Isabel down. The girl clung to his hand tightly, her eyes scanning the place with a mixture of hope and fear. Together they approached the board, where a middle-aged woman organized the new additions. "Good morning, Carmen," greeted Matteo, uncomfortable under the curious glances his presence awakened. He rarely came down to the village, and never accompanied. "Matteo Suarez, I thought the storm would have taken you with your trees," responded the woman with a tired smile. Her eyes drifted to Isabel. "And this little one? I found her sheltering in my barn during the worst of the storm. We're looking for her family." Carmen stooped to be at the girl's height. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Isabel Montero," she replied, her voice barely audible. Matteo felt the world stop for an instant. Montero, the same surname as Elena. Carmen seemed not to notice his disturbance. "Isabel Montero," she repeated, checking. "Her list? Yes, here you are. Your mother is in the hospital. She's been asking for you since they found her." Isabel's face lit up with a hope so intense it seemed to transform her completely. "My mom is alive?" she asked, as if afraid that saying it aloud might undo the miracle. "Yes, little one. She's injured but stable. They found her clinging to a tree when the river overflowed near her house." Matteo was trying to process the information. Elena Montero. After 20 years, the name he had, tried to bury under layers of silence and work, was materializing again in his life. Isabel's mother, the woman he had loved with the painful intensity of youth, the one who had left without saying goodbye, taking with her the only part of his soul he had offered to the world. "Can we go see her?" Isabel's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Of course," he responded, and his own voice sounded strange to him, as if it belonged to someone else. The village hospital was a small and austere building, but efficient. The waiting room was full of people with various degrees of injuries and concern on their faces. A nurse received them with professional kindness. "Mrs. Montero is resting now," she explained. "The doctor prefers that she not receive visitors until tomorrow." The disappointment on Isabel's face was so profound that Matteo felt a protective impulse he thought forgotten. "She's her daughter," he intervened. "She's been separated from her during the storm. Perhaps just to see her for a moment." The nurse hesitated but finally nodded. 5 minutes, no more. The patient needs absolute rest. As they followed the nurse down the antiseptic hallway, Matteo felt that each step brought him closer to a precipice. How would he react upon seeing Elena after so much time? Would she recognize him? Would Isabel know who he really was? The room was small, with a window that overlooked the hospital's back garden, where an old cherry tree was beginning to recover from the storm. In the bed, a pale figure breathed with apparent tranquility, connected to monitors that emitted rhythmic beeps. Isabel released Matteo's hand and ran to the bed. "Mom," she whispered, taking the inert hand in hers. Matteo remained paralyzed at the threshold. The woman in the bed was not Elena Montero. The initial confusion gave way to a more complex realization. The woman who lay in the hospital bed was not Elena Montero, the young woman Matteo had loved 20 years ago. It was Lara Montero, her younger sister, a matured version of the shy teenager who used to accompany Elena on some of their secret dates, always keeping her distance, observing with silent eyes. The nurse, mistaking his expression of astonishment for concern, explained in a low voice, "She suffered a head trauma. She's stable, but the doctors fear there may be neurological damage. She hasn't fully regained consciousness yet." Matteo nodded mechanically. His mind was working at full speed, trying to fit this new piece into the puzzle that had begun to form since Isabel's appearance. If Lara was the girl's mother, where was Elena? What had become of her in all these years? Isabel caressed her mother's face with the delicacy with which one touches a fragile flower. Her tears fell silently on the pillow. "She's going to wake up, right?" she asked, without taking her gaze from Lara. "Of course she will," responded Matteo, finally approaching the bed. "She's a Montero, and the Monteros are strong as oaks." A nurse entered to indicate that the visiting time was over. Isabel resisted at first, but Matteo promised they would return the next day, early. Reluctantly, the girl said goodbye to her mother with a kiss on the forehead. As they returned to the truck, Isabel remained unusually silent even by her standards. She held the wooden box so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "Can I stay with you until my mom wakes up?" she finally asked, when they were already on their way back to the ranch. The question took Matteo by surprise. Part of him had assumed that with the mother found, Isabel would be under the care of some relative or social services. The idea of continuing to share his space, his routine, his carefully constructed solitude with that girl of two wise eyes had not crossed his mind. "Don't you have other relatives?" he asked, trying to buy time while his mind processed the possibility. Isabel shook her head. "It's just Mom and me. It's always been that way." The simplicity of the response concealed deeper questions that Matteo didn't dare to formulate. Who was Isabel's father? Why did Lara live isolated with her daughter without the support of the extensive Montero family? "I suppose you could stay a few days," he finally conceded, "until your mother improves." Isabel's smile illuminated the interior of the truck, and Matteo felt a strange warmth expanding in his chest, a sensation he had forgotten could exist. That night, while preparing a simple dinner in his cabin's kitchen, Matteo observed Isabel sitting on the porch, contemplating the first stars. The girl had finally opened the wooden box and held something in her hands, something she looked at with almost painful intensity. Curiosity won over his usual respect for others' privacy. With 2 cups of hot chocolate as an excuse, he went out to the porch and sat next to her on the steps. "I thought you might want something warm," he offered, extending one of the cups. Isabel accepted the drink with a shy smile. Between her fingers, Matteo could see what she was contemplating so carefully, an old photograph worn at the edges. A young couple smiled at the camera, he with a cowboy hat and a carefree smile. She, Matteo's heart skipped a beat. The woman in the photograph was Elena. "May I see it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice from betraying the interior storm that had just unleashed. Isabel hesitated a moment, but finally extended the photograph to him. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Matteo felt something ancient and powerful flowing between them, like an underground current that connects distant springs. The image was exactly what he feared. Elena and him, 20 years ago, under the old oak at the lookout where they used to meet. He remembered perfectly the day it was taken. It had been their last encounter, though neither of them knew it then. 3 days later, Elena disappeared from his life without explanation. He turned the photograph over. On the back, written in handwriting he would recognize among thousands, it read, "EM plus MS, always," and a date, May 15th, 2003. "Who are they?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "My Aunt Eleanor and someone she loved very much," responded Isabel. "My mum gave me this box when I turned 7. She said it was important, that it held secrets I would someday understand." Matteo returned the photograph with slightly trembling hands. "Your mother was right. Some secrets need time to be understood." Isabel put the photograph back in the box and closed it carefully. Then, to Matteo's surprise, she rested her head against his arm in a gesture of trust that completely disarmed him. "I think my mom recognized you," said the girl, with the inexplicable certainty of childhood. "Even though she was asleep, I felt that she knew." Matteo didn't respond. He couldn't. A knot had formed in his throat, a knot made of unanswered questions, of years of self-imposed solitude, of a love he had never managed to completely bury. They remained like that in silence while the stars continued their eternal dance above the valley that was beginning to heal its wounds. Like themselves, thought Matteo, damaged by ancient storms, but perhaps, just perhaps, on the way to an unexpected healing. The following days established a routine that, to Matteo's surprise, felt surprisingly natural. Isabel adapted to life on the ranch, with the fluidity of water finding its course. She woke at dawn, helped feed the animals, learned the names of each plant in the garden that Matteo cultivated next to the cabin. Her laughter, at first scarce and contained, began to flow with greater freedom, especially when she was near Tormenta, the mare that seemed to have adopted the girl as part of her herd. Every morning they visited the hospital. Lara remained unconscious, although the doctors assured that her vital signs were improving. Isabel talked to her for hours, telling her about her new life on the ranch, about the animals, about Matteo and his magic hands that turned wood into birds and flowers. "Mr. Matteo looks like the man in the photo," she told her sleeping mother one day, not realizing that Matteo, who had gone out to get coffee, was returning at that moment and overheard. "I think it's him, Mum. The man you and Aunt Elena always talk about when you think I'm not listening." Matteo stopped in his tracks, his heart beating forcefully in his chest. Elena spoke of him. After so many years. The possibility opened a crack in the armor he had built around his heart. That afternoon, back at the ranch, an unexpected visit awaited them. Carmen, the woman from the bulletin board, was sitting on the porch with a folder on her lap and a grave expression. "Matteo," she greeted, standing up, "we need to talk about Isabel's situation." The girl, who was brushing Tormenta in the nearby corral, couldn't hear them. Matteo invited Carmen into the cabin. "Social services has become involved," explained. Carmen, once inside. "Lara will need to be transferred to a hospital in the capital for specialized treatment. Isabel can't accompany her, and without other locatable relatives—" "I can take care of her," interrupted Matteo, surprising himself with the firmness of his declaration. Carmen looked at him with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. "Matteo, you're a single man who lives in isolation. You have no experience with children. The standard procedure would be—" "I know the family," he interrupted again. "I knew the Monteros years ago, and the girl trusts me." He wasn't telling the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. The situation was too complex to explain in bureaucratic terms. Carmen sighed, closing the folder. "I'll have to make a report. There will be follow-up visits, evaluations, whatever is necessary." When Carmen left, Matteo stood for a long time contemplating the horizon from the window. At what point had he decided to open not only the doors of his house, but also those of a life carefully constructed to exclude any possibility of pain? The answer came in the form of childish laughter. Isabel had managed to get Tormenta to gallop in circles following her, a spectacle he had never witnessed. Time has strange ways of healing old wounds, he thought. Sometimes it uses devastating storms to rebuild bridges we believed destroyed forever. That night, while Isabel slept, Matteo took out from the bottom of an old trunk a box similar to the one the girl treasured. He had carved it so many years ago for Elena, but never got to give it to her. Inside he kept memories of a time he had tried to forget. Letters never sent, a lock of dark hair tied with a blue ribbon, drawings of a future that never materialized. Among the objects he found what he was looking for, a twin photograph to the one Isabel kept, the same scene, the same day, but taken with his camera. On the back, in his irregular handwriting, he had written, "EM, plus MS forever," and a Tate, May 15th, 2003. It was as if destiny had been sending him signals for years, signals he had refused to interpret, until now. The annual Spring Festival was approaching. It was the first major communal celebration after the storm, and the entire valley seemed to vibrate with renewed energy. Isabel was excited at the prospect of attending, of seeing the traditional dances, the craft stalls, the contests. "My mom always took me," she explained, while helping Matteo repair a damaged fence. "She says it's important to remember where we come from, to celebrate what we are." "Your mother is a wise woman," responded Matteo, observing how Isabel's small hands held the nails with surprising precision. "Don't you ever go?" asked the girl, looking up at him. Matteo shrugged. "I'm not very fond of crowds. But this year you'll go with me, right?" The hope in her voice was impossible to ignore. "I suppose I'll make an exception," he conceded, and was rewarded with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire valley. That afternoon, a new visit altered their routine. A woman of distinguished appearance, with her hair pulled back in a severe bun and metal-framed glasses, introduced herself as Lucia Peralta, a social worker sent to evaluate Isabel's situation. "I need to speak with the child alone," she declared, after the formal introductions. Matteo nodded, although a part of him resisted leaving Isabel with that woman of impenetrable expression. The girl, however, seemed calm, as if she understood the importance of that meeting. While waiting on the porch, Matteo tried not to imagine what might be happening inside. What questions would she be asking? What would Isabel answer? Would she mention the photograph, the connection that seemed to exist between him and the Monteros? After what seemed like an eternity, the door opened and Mrs. Peralta came out, followed by Isabel. The girl seemed serene, but there was a shadow of concern in her eyes that Matteo had learned to recognize. "Mr. Suarez," said the social worker in a professional tone, "I must admit that the situation is peculiar. The girl seems happy and well cared for, and she expresses great affection toward you." Matteo waited. He knew a but was coming. "However, it remains a temporary solution. We are looking for other relatives, and there is the possibility that Mrs. Montero will be transferred to the capital next week. In that case, we would have to reconsider the current arrangements." Isabel approached Matteo, and in a gesture that seemed both a defense and a declaration, took his hand. The contact, so simple and yet so profound, conveyed a clear message. They belonged to each other in a way that no official form could capture. "I understand," responded Matteo, gently squeezing Isabel's hand. "Meanwhile, we'll continue as before." After Mrs. Peralta left, promising to return soon with news, Isabel remained unusually quiet. That night, during dinner, she finally spoke. "I asked her if you could adopt me if my mom doesn't wake up." The declaration hit Matteo like an unexpected wave. The spoon he was holding remained suspended halfway between the plate and his mouth. "Isabel," he began, not knowing how to continue. "She didn't say no," the girl continued, with that mixture of innocence and ancient wisdom that characterized her. "She said it was complicated, that there were procedures, but she didn't say it was impossible." Matteo put down the spoon and looked directly into those eyes that, with each passing day, reminded him more of Eleanor's, of his own. "Your mother is going to wake up," he said firmly. "And when she does, we'll have much to talk about, the three of us." Isabel nodded, as if she understood the weight of those words, the mystery that floated between them like the morning mist over the valley, simultaneously revealing and concealing. "She always said that someday I would meet my father," murmured the girl, returning her attention to the plate. "That, when the time was right, destiny would bring us together." And with that simple declaration, the last fragment of the puzzle fell into place in Matteo's mind. The photograph, the dates, Isabel's eyes, the immediate connection, the way Tormenta, the animal he himself had raised from a foal, had accepted the girl as if she recognized her. The truth hit him with the force of lightning. Isabel was not Elena's niece. She was her daughter, and his. The spring festival transformed Valle de Las Rosas into an explosion of color and music. The streets, still with scars from the storm, filled with stalls of crafts, food, and flowers. The inhabitants, as if they had collectively agreed to leave the tragedy behind, wore their best clothes and smiled with renewed hope. Matteo felt like a stranger in his own village. It had been years since he had attended a communal celebration, and the sensation of being surrounded by so many people overwhelmed him. Only Isabel's presence by his side, with her blue dress and a crown of wildflowers that she herself had woven, anchored him to the present reality, preventing him from retreating to the solitude that had been his refuge for so long. "Matteo Suarez, my eyes can't believe it." The rough and affectionate voice of Don Emilio, the old blacksmith, pulled him from his thoughts. "I thought we'd have to wait for another storm to see you at the festival." Matteo sketched an uncomfortable smile as Don Emilio patted him on the shoulder. The old man then noticed Isabel. "And this beauty?" he asked, bending down to be at the girl's height. "Isabel Montero," she introduced herself, extending her small hand with a formality that contrasted with her crown of wildflowers. Don Emilio shook the offered hand, but his expression changed upon hearing the surname. His eyes, shrewd under bushy eyebrows, moved from the girl to Matteo several times. "Montero," he repeated, as if savoring the name. From the Monteros of the big hacienda? Before Isabel could respond, a young woman approached the group. She wore a simple white dress and had her hair pulled back in a braid adorned with small red flowers. Something in her face seemed vaguely familiar to Mateo. "Excuse me," she intervened in a soft voice. "Are you Mateo Suarez?" Mateo nodded, intrigued. The woman smiled with relief. "I'm Ana Peralta, the primary school teacher. I've been looking for you. They told me you would be at the festival." Her gaze settled on Isabel, and a shadow of emotion crossed her face. "Isabel, I can't believe you're all right. We've all been looking for you since the storm." The girl looked at her with curiosity, but without the recognition that the teacher seemed to expect. "You don't remember me, do you?" asked Anna with an understanding smile. "I was at your house several times. I'm a friend of your mother's." Isabel's eyes lit up. "You know my mom? Have you been to see her?" Anna nodded, and her expression became more serious. "In fact, I come from the hospital. The doctors have decided to transfer Lara to the capital early tomorrow. There's a specialist who believes he can help her, but..." She didn't finish the sentence, but her gaze conveyed what the words didn't. The situation was delicate. Isabel, with that intuition characteristic of children, captured the gravity hidden in the silence. "Can I go see her now?" she asked, her voice transforming into that of a much younger child. Anna and Mateo exchanged glances. "I think it would be good for you to see her before the transfer," conceded Anna. "We could go together." Isabel sought Mateo's approval, who nodded silently. As they walked toward the hospital, moving away from the festive bustle, Anna approached Mateo to speak without the girl, who was walking a few steps ahead, being able to hear them. "Carmen told me about your situation. Thank you for taking care of her." "There's nothing to thank me for," responded Mateo sincerely. "Isabel is special." Anna looked at him, intensely, as if evaluating him. "Lara always spoke of you with great respect. She said you were the most honorable man she had ever known." The declaration took Mateo by surprise. "Lara spoke of me. We barely knew each other." An enigmatic expression crossed Anna's face. "Appearances can be deceiving, Mr. Suarez. There are bonds that exist beyond physical encounters." Before Mateo could inquire further, they arrived at the hospital. The festive atmosphere had been left behind, replaced by the asepsis and stillness characteristic of places where life and death wage their silent battles. Lara's room was in half-darkness, illuminated only by the soft light that filtered through the partially open curtains. Isabel ran to her mother's bed and took her hand. Mateo remained at the threshold, suddenly aware that he was intruding on an intimate moment. "Mom," whispered Isabel, "they're going to take you to another hospital tomorrow. A big one, in the city, so you can get better." She paused, as if waiting for an answer that didn't come. "Don't worry about me, I'm fine, I'm with Mr. Mateo. He's good, Mom, he takes care of me, and he takes care of Tormenta, his mare. He lets me ride her, and he carved a wooden bird for me, just like the ones in the box you gave me." Mateo felt a knot in his throat. Isabel's devotion to her mother, expressed in those simple words, contrasted painfully with the questions that seethed within him. If Isabel was really his daughter, what role had Lara played in all this? Why had Elena disappeared? What secrets did that family hold that seemed intertwined with his destiny in ways he was just beginning to understand? Anna approached him and offered him a cup of coffee. The mundane gesture anchored him back to the present reality. "Lara always spoke of you as the man of the forest," commented Anna, observing Isabel, who continued talking to her unconscious mother. "She said that someday Isabel would meet you, that it was important for her story." "I don't understand," confessed Mateo. "I barely knew Lara. It was Elena with whom—" He stopped, unable to put into words what he had felt for Elena Montero so many years ago. Anna looked at him with a mixture of compassion and something else, something that seemed like knowledge of a secret he was unaware of. "Perhaps you should ask Isabel about the box," she suggested. "It doesn't just hold the photograph you already know." Mateo wanted to ask more, but at that moment a doctor entered the room. His grave expression made everyone fall silent. "Miss Peralta," he greeted with a nod. "Mr. Suarez, I need to speak with you about tomorrow's transfer." Isabel, perceiving that the conversation didn't include her, approached the window and contemplated the festival that continued in the square. From that height, the colored lights could be seen, the distant music could be heard, life that followed its course could be perceived, while in that room time seemed suspended. Mrs. Montero's Condition has become complicated, explained the doctor in a low voice. The transfer is risky but necessary. In the capital, they have the equipment to treat the type of brain injury she presents. What's the prognosis? Asked Matteo, surprising himself with his involvement in a matter that technically didn't concern him. The doctor sighed, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. Uncertain. She could wake up tomorrow, or in a month, or... He didn't complete the phrase, but it wasn't necessary. The possibility that Lara might never wake up floated in the air like a tangible ghost. And the girl? Asked Anna, looking toward Isabel. Who will take care of her during the treatment? Social Services is looking for relatives, responded the doctor. Meanwhile, Mr. Suarez has been authorized as a temporary guardian, as I understand it. Matteo nodded, feeling the weight of that responsibility as never before. It was no longer just about offering shelter for a few days. Isabel's future, of that girl who was possibly his daughter, now depended on decisions he didn't feel prepared to make. Upon leaving the hospital, the contrast between the gravity of the situation and the joy of the festival in full swing was almost painful. Isabel walked between them in silence, lost in thoughts too deep for her age. "Do you want to go back to the festival?" asked Matteo, trying to distract her. "You haven't tried the traditional sweets yet." "I want to go back to the ranch," she responded. "I want to show you something." The determination in her voice was impossible to ignore. They said goodbye to Anna, who promised to visit them soon with news about Lara's transfer, and set off back to the ranch. The sky was beginning to turn orange and violet when they arrived. Isabel ran directly to the room she now occupied and returned with the wooden box. With a solemnity that contrasted with her small figure, she placed it on the kitchen table. "My mum said that when I found the man in the photograph, I should show him everything in the box," she declared, looking Matteo directly in the eyes. "I think it's you. You're just like in the photo, only more..." "Older?" suggested Matteo, trying to lighten the moment. "Sadder," corrected Isabel. The observation, so simple and yet so accurate, left Matteo speechless. Isabel opened the box carefully. Inside, besides the photograph he already knew, there were several letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, a small lock of dark hair, and a simple ring with a green stone. "My mum said this belonged to my real mother," explained Isabel, taking out the ring, "that she would give it to me when I was older, but that until then, I should keep it here, safe." Matteo took the ring with trembling hands. He recognized it immediately. He had bought it for Elena at the last market they attended together. A simple emerald, mounted in silver, nothing ostentatious, but she had loved it, saying it reminded her of the exact color of Matteo's eyes in the dawn light. "Your real mother?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Isabel nodded, now taking out the letters. "Aunt Elena. My mum told me that she had to go far away, that she couldn't take care of me. So she left me with my mom Lara, who is her sister, and promised to come back someday." The world seemed to stop around Matteo. Each piece of the puzzle now fit with painful clarity. Elena had been pregnant when she disappeared. She hadn't abandoned him by choice, but due to some circumstance that forced her to leave not only the man she loved, but also the daughter she was expecting. With trembling hands, he untied the ribbon that held the letters together. The first, dated 20 years ago, was addressed to him. "Dear Matteo," it began in Elena's delicate handwriting, "when you read this, if it ever reaches your hands, you will probably hate me. I have left you without explanation, without goodbye, taking with me a secret you have the right to know." Matteo looked up at Isabel, who was watching him with a mixture of curiosity and understanding that went far beyond her years. In her eyes, of the same intense green as his own, he saw reflected a future he had never imagined possible, a future in which solitude was no longer the only path. "I think," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "that we have much to talk about, Isabel, and many letters to read together." The girl nodded with a serene smile, as if she had always known this moment would come. Outside, twilight gave way to night, and the first stars appeared in the sky, silent witnesses to a past that finally began to heal. Night extended like a velvet mantle over the ranch. Isabel, exhausted by the day's emotions, had fallen asleep on the sofa while Matteo read the letters by the dim light of the oil lamp. He carried her to her room, tucked her in carefully, and returned to the living room where Elena's words, written so many years ago, waited for him like silent witnesses, of a time he thought forever lost. The letters revealed a painful and complex story. Eleanor had discovered her pregnancy just 2 weeks after her last encounter with Matteo. When she gathered the courage to tell her family, the reaction was immediate and brutal. Her father, Augusto Montero, a proud and authoritarian man, decreed that no daughter of his would have a child by a simple ranch hand. The options were clear: get rid of the baby or be disinherited and expelled from the family. Eleanor refused to give up her child, but before she could contact Matteo, her father sent her to a retreat abroad, in reality an elegant way to hide his unmarried daughter's pregnancy. Lara, barely a teenager then, was the only one who maintained contact with her during those months of exile. The original plan was to give the baby up for adoption immediately after birth, but when Elena held her daughter in her arms for the first time, she knew she couldn't give her to strangers. In a desperate act of love, she convinced Lara to pretend the baby was hers, the fruit of a teenage relationship. The lie would cost both of them their relationship with their family, but it would allow them to keep the girl close. "I never had the courage to look for you afterward," Elena wrote in the last letter, dated just 3 years ago. "The shame, the fear of your rejection, the promise I made to Lara to keep the secret until Isabel was older, but I always knew that someday destiny would find a way to bring you together. Isabel has your eyes, Matteo, your way of looking at the world, your connection with animals. When I see her, I see you, and I feel that a part of our love survived despite everything." Matteo put the letter on the table and covered his face with his hands. 20 years of self-imposed solitude, of silent bitterness, of unanswered questions. And all that time, his daughter had grown up just a few hours away, carrying in her veins the blood of the Suarez, in her eyes the color of the forest he loved so much. The sound of light footsteps brought him out of his reflections. Isabel, barefoot and with her hair tousled from sleep, peered into the living room. "Are you sad?" she asked with that direct frankness characteristic of childhood. Matteo shook his head, although the tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in decades threatened to overflow his eyes. "No, little one. I'm remembering." Isabel approached, and without asking permission, sat on his lap, as if that were her natural place in the world. The gesture, so spontaneous and trusting, completely disarmed Matteo. "My mom Lara says that remembering is important," commented the girl, leaning against his chest. "That our memories are like seeds. Some grow into beautiful flowers, others into plants with thorns, but all are ours." Matteo smiled at the wisdom contained in those words. "Your mom is a very wise woman." "Both my moms are," corrected Isabel seriously. "Aunt Elena, too, although I rarely see her. She only comes at Christmas and on my birthday, and she always looks like she's going to cry but never does." The mention of Elena made Matteo's heart skip a beat. She was alive, near, perhaps even in regular contact with Lara and Isabel. "Do you know where your Aunt Elena lives?" he asked, trying to make his voice sound casual. "Far away, very far. She says her work forces her to travel a lot. She always brings me gifts from places with strange names." Matteo nodded, processing the information. Part of him wanted to know everything about Elena, where she was, what had become of her life, if she had ever thought of looking for him. Another part, the one that had learned to protect itself during years of solitude, feared the answers to those questions. "You know something," said Isabel, interrupting his thoughts. "I think you're my dad." The declaration, so simple and direct, fell between them like a stone in a still pond, generating waves that reached the most remote shores of their lives. "Why do you think that?" asked Matteo, although he knew the girl's intuition had hit the mark. "Because we have the same eyes, and because horses love you like me, and because sometimes, when you don't realize it, you do this with your nose." Isabel wrinkled her nose slightly, in a gesture identical to what Matteo did when he was concentrating. "Just like me." Matteo smiled, unable to continue hiding the truth in the face of such irrefutable childish logic. "I think you're right, Isabel. I think I'm your dad." The girl nodded, as if they had just confirmed something she had always known. "Does that mean I can stay with you forever, even when Mom Lara wakes up?" The question enclosed a complexity that went far beyond what Isabel could understand. It implied difficult conversations, legal decisions, reconciliations with the past that Matteo wasn't even sure he could face. "It means," he responded slowly, "that no matter what happens, we will always be connected. The blood that runs through your veins is the same that runs through mine. That will never change." Isabel seemed satisfied with the answer. She yawned and snuggled closer against him. "Tell me a story," she asked, her eyelids beginning to close again. Matteo thought for a moment, and then began, his voice deep and soft in the stillness of the night. "Long ago, in this very valley, there lived a man who believed that solitude was his only destiny. He had built his life among trees and animals, convinced that humans only brought pain. But one day, after a great storm, he found in his barn a small traveler who would change his world forever." Isabel smiled in her half-sleep, recognizing her own story transformed into a tale. When she finally fell asleep, Matteo contemplated her for a long time, marveled at the miracle that this life represented. A life he had helped create, and that, by a whim of destiny, had returned to him when he least expected it. At dawn, he was awakened by the sound of a vehicle approaching. He had fallen asleep in the armchair with Isabel in his arms. Carefully, so as not to wake her, he settled her among the cushions and went out to the porch. Ana Peralta was getting out of a small blue car. Her expression was grave. "Good morning, Matteo," she greeted, and the use of his first name indicated an urgency that went beyond formalities. "Lara will be transferred in an hour. I thought Isabel would want to say goodbye." "Of course," responded Matteo. "I'll wake her." "There's something else," added Ana, stopping him with a gesture. "They've located Elena Montero." The name, pronounced aloud after so many years of existing only in his thoughts and memories, provoked in Matteo a mixture of emotions so intense that he had to lean on the porch railing. "Where?" was all he could ask. "In Buenos Aires. She's a photographer for an international magazine. They contacted her last night, and she's taking the first available flight. She'll arrive tomorrow." Matteo nodded, unable to articulate words. After 20 years, Elena would return to the valley. He would see her again, talk to her, the mother of his daughter, the woman he had never managed to forget. "There's something you should know," continued Ana, and her tone suggested it wasn't easy news. "Elena is married. She has 2 small children." The information hit Matteo with the force of a physical punch. Of course, Elena had moved on with her life. 20 years was too long to remain anchored in a past love. Only he had been stubborn enough, wounded enough, to turn solitude into a lifestyle. "I understand," he responded, though he wasn't sure he understood anything at all. "Thank you for letting me know." Ana looked at him with compassion. "Things are rarely what they seem, Matteo, especially when it comes to the Monteros." Before he could ask her what she meant exactly, Isabel appeared at the door, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Are we going to see Mom?" she asked upon recognizing Ana. The teacher nodded, extending a hand toward the girl. "Yes, sweetheart. We have to say goodbye before she goes to the city." Isabel took the offered hand, but then turned to Matteo. "Are you coming with us, Dad?" The word, pronounced like that for the first time, aloud and without hesitation, resonated in the morning air like the toll of a distant bell. Ana looked at Matteo with a raised eyebrow, but showed no greater surprise. "Of course I'm coming," he responded, trying to make his voice sound normal despite the knot in his throat. "I couldn't let you go alone." As they prepared to leave, Matteo contemplated the valley that stretched out in front of his cabin. The first rays of the sun bathed the hills with a golden light, making the dewdrops shine like tiny diamonds on the grass. Almost 2 weeks had passed since the storm that had changed his life. The landscape had recovered, healing its wounds with the stubborn determination of nature. Perhaps, thought Matteo as he helped Isabel into the car, human. Hearts worked in a similar way. Perhaps it was time to allow old wounds to heal, to let light enter the darkest corners of his soul, to accept that change, though painful, could bring unexpected beauty. Elena was returning, and with her, perhaps, the answers to questions he had carried within him for 20 long years. The hospital presented unusual activity for such an early hour. Doctors and nurses moved with controlled efficiency, preparing everything for Lara's transfer to the capital. The room, which before had seemed a haven of stillness amid the chaos, was now the epicenter of methodical bustle. Isabel remained beside her mother's bed, holding her inert hand, while the medical staff made the final preparations. Matteo observed from the door, feeling that he was intruding on an intimate moment. Now that he knew the truth, that Lara had sacrificed her own youth, her relationship with her family, to raise her sister's daughter, his daughter, the admiration he felt for this woman, he barely knew had multiplied exponentially. "You have 5 minutes," indicated a nurse with professional kindness. "After that, we'll have to take her." Isabel nodded, pressing Lara's hand between hers. "Mum," she whispered, "you're going to a big hospital where they can help you better. Don't be afraid, I'm fine, I'm with—" She looked briefly toward Matteo, "with my dad, and when you wake up, we'll be waiting for you." The declaration, so simple and yet so loaded with meaning, made Matteo feel a tightness in his chest. In just a few days, that girl had completely redefined his existence, granting him a title for which he had never prepared: father. Anna, who until then had remained discreetly to one side, approached Isabel and put a hand on her shoulder. "Your Aunt Elena will be here tomorrow," she said softly. "She's coming from very far away to be with you." Isabel nodded without surprise. She seemed to have already assumed that the storm had set in motion forces that would reunite her entire family, scattered until then. "She'll like meeting my dad," she said with the unshakable certainty of childhood. "She always says he would have been a good father." Matteo felt himself blush, uncomfortable at the idea that Elena had spoken of him with the girl. What else might she have told her? What image did Isabel have of that absent father, who now, by a whim of destiny, materialized in her life? The stretcher-bearers finally entered to transfer Lara. Isabel moved away reluctantly, allowing them to disconnect the monitors and prepare the bed for transport. As they passed by Matteo, taking away the woman who had raised his daughter as her own, he felt a sudden impulse. "Wait," he asked, approaching the stretcher. He leaned over Lara and, in a whisper that only she could hear, if she could hear anything in her state, said, "Thank you for taking care of her. Thank you for loving her when I couldn't. I promise I'll protect her until you return." He wasn't sure why he had felt the need to say those words, but in pronouncing them, something seemed to lighten inside him, as if he had fulfilled a ritual necessary to move forward. As the ambulance moved away from the hospital, Isabel remained by the window, watching until the vehicle disappeared in the distance. Then she turned to Matteo and Anna with a surprisingly serene expression. "Can we go home now?" she asked, addressing Matteo. The simplicity with which she called home his cabin, a place where she had been for just a few days, deeply moved him. "Of course," he responded. "Would you like Anna to come with us? We could prepare breakfast together." Isabel nodded, and the three set off back to the ranch. During the journey, Anna explained the practical details of the transfer. Lara would be in the intensive care unit of the central hospital, the doctors would send daily reports, and Elena would be contacted upon her arrival to make medical decisions as a direct relative. "Will I be able to visit her?" asked Isabel from the back seat. "As soon as the doctors say it's possible," promised Anna. "I'll take you myself." The morning passed in a strange normality. They prepared omelets with herbs from the garden, fed the animals, and Anna helped Isabel organize her few belongings in the room she now permanently occupied. Matteo observed them, marveling at the ease with which his space, so jealously guarded for years, was transforming into a home. When Anna left, promising to return the next day to accompany them to the airport to receive Elena, Matteo found himself alone with Isabel for the first time since the truth had come to light. The girl was sitting on the porch, drawing intently in a notebook Anna had brought her. "May I see?" asked Matteo, sitting beside her. Isabel showed him the drawing. A house, his cabin, surrounded by trees and animals. In front of the house, 4 figures holding hands: a girl, 2 women, and a man with a hat. "It's us," explained Isabel, pointing to each figure. "You, me, Mom Lara, and Aunt Elena, all together." The simplicity of the drawing contrasted with the complexity of what it represented. A family fragmented by secrets and circumstances, now reunited by the unpredictable force of destiny. Matteo felt a tightness in his throat. "It's very beautiful," he managed to say. "Can I hang it in the kitchen?" Isabel nodded, pleased, and handed him the drawing. As he fixed it with magnets to the refrigerator, Matteo felt a sudden vertigo at the transformation of his life. 2 weeks ago, his cabin was a sanctuary of solitude. Now it had children's drawings on the refrigerator. The rest of the day passed in a routine that was beginning to feel familiar to them. Matteo worked on repairs to the barn, while Isabel, seated on a bale of hay, read a book Anna had lent her, occasionally looking up to observe him working. From time to time she asked him questions, small windows into an infinite curiosity. Why do you live alone? How did you learn to carve wood? Did you know my grandparents? Do you have siblings? Do you like living here? Matteo responded with sincerity, discovering that talking about his past, about his choices, was surprisingly easy with that girl who looked at him without judgment, only with genuine interest. He told her about his father who had taught him to work with wood, about his mother who died when he was a teenager, about how he had come to the valley looking for work and had fallen in love with the place, and then with a young woman of easy laughter and deep gaze. He didn't mention how Elena's departure had devastated him, how he had decided it was safer to live among trees and animals than risk being abandoned again. But Isabel, with that intuition that seemed to go far beyond her years, appeared to understand it anyway. Sometimes it's easier to be alone, she commented, as they returned to the cabin to prepare dinner. When you're with people, they can hurt you. Matteo looked at her, surprised by the depth of the observation. Who hurt you, little one? He asked softly. Isabel shrugged, a gesture too adult for her tiny figure. The kids at school, they say things about me and Mum, that we're weird, that I don't have a dad, that we live apart because we're hiding something. The revelation provoked in Matteo a wave of protective indignation. Well, now you have a dad, he declared, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. And anyone who says something like that to you will have to deal with me. Isabel smiled, and in that smile Matteo saw a reflection of the one Elena had dedicated to him so many times under the oak at the lookout. That night, while Isabel slept, Matteo sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, contemplating the stars that dotted the black sky like diamonds on velvet. Tomorrow he would see Eleanor again. After 20 years, he would once more encounter those eyes that had pursued him in dreams, that voice he had believed silenced forever. Eleanor, married, with children, with a life completely separate from his own. The thought provoked contradictory feelings in him. Joy to know she had found her way, pain at the confirmation that what they once shared had truly remained in the past, curiosity to meet the woman she had become, and above all questions. So many questions accumulated during 20 years of silence. Why hadn't she tried to contact him afterward, when she was already an adult, free from her father's influence? Why had she allowed Lara to raise Isabel instead of fighting for custody of her own daughter? Had she thought of him at all, as he had thought of her every day since her departure? As the coffee grew cold between his hands, Matteo contemplated the possibility that the answers weren't what he expected, that the story he had constructed in his mind during all these years, Elena forced to leave him against her will, secretly yearning for him, was just that, a construction, a fantasy to make the abandonment bearable. He had almost decided to go to bed when a sound caught his attention, the unmistakable purr of an engine approaching by the ranch road. At that hour, in that remote place, visitors were extraordinary. He stood up, alert, and descended the porch steps. The headlights of a vehicle illuminated the clearing in front of the cabin, projecting elongated shadows on the ground. The car stopped and the engine turned off, leaving an expectant silence. The driver's door opened and a female figure descended with fluid movements, tall, slender, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that fell over her left shoulder. Even in the penumbra, Matteo recognized her immediately. Not the Eleanor of his memories, young and impetuous, but a mature woman whose presence seemed to radiate a serenity she hadn't possessed before. She stayed by the car for a moment, as if gathering courage before advancing toward him. "Matteo," she said, and her voice, deeper than in his memories but unmistakably hers, seemed to unleash something within him, as if a rope stretched too tightly finally broke. "You arrived early," was all he could say, the words sticking in his throat. Elena nodded, stopping a few meters from him, respecting the space that 20 years of absence had created between them. "I took an earlier flight, I couldn't wait." They remained like that, observing each other in the semi-darkness, with 2 decades of silence expanding between them like a swift river. And then, from the cabin, came a sleepy voice. "Dad? Who is it?" Isabel appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. her small figure silhouetted against the interior light. Upon seeing the newcomer, she stopped in her tracks, now completely awake. "Aunt Elena?" she asked, incredulous. Elena took a step forward, and the light from the cabin illuminated her face. Matteo saw the tears that shone in her eyes, the emotion contained in the tension of her jaw, the superhuman effort she seemed to be making to hold herself together. "Hello, my life," she responded, extending her arms. Isabel ran to her, launching herself with such force that she almost knocked her down. Elena enveloped her in a fierce embrace, burying her face in the girl's hair, and finally allowed the tears to flow freely. Matteo observed the scene as if it were happening in another dimension, too surreal to be part of his daily life. Mother and daughter reunited after so much time, and he, the father who never knew he had a daughter, as a silent witness to a moment he never believed possible. Elena raised her gaze and her eyes found Matteo's over Isabel's head. In them he saw fear, gratitude, pain, hope, and a silent question that needed no words. "Could you ever forgive me?" And Matteo, who had spent 20 years building walls around his heart, felt them begin to crumble, stone by stone, before the force of that gaze that had once been his entire universe. The cabin's kitchen, silent witness to so many years of solitude, had never housed a meeting so charged, with contained emotions. Isabel, now fully awake, prepared tea with the seriousness of one who executes a sacred ritual. Matteo and Elena sat at opposite ends of the table, avoiding looking directly at each other, as if they feared that simple eye contact could unleash a storm too long repressed. "Your tea is very good," commented Elena, when Isabel finally served the steaming cups. "I make it with herbs from Dad's garden," responded the girl with pride, sitting between them like a small bridge. Over a 20-year abyss. Matteo observed Elena discreetly. Time had been generous with her. The lines at the corners of her eyes and lips only added character to her face, like marks of intensely lived experiences. Her hair, once black as night, now showed some silver strands that shone under the dim light of the lamp. "How is Lara?" Elena finally asked, breaking the silence. "Anna told me they transferred her today." "The doctors say she's stable," responded Matteo, "but she hasn't awakened yet." Elena nodded, her fingers nervously playing with the edge of the cup. She was always the strongest of the two, though no one believed it. Everyone saw her shyness, her gentleness, and confused it with weakness. But Lara, her voice broke slightly. "Lara has a strength I never had." "She'll wake up," affirmed Isabel, with the unbreakable certainty that only children can possess. "And when she does, we'll all be together." Elena and Matteo exchanged a fleeting glance, aware of the complexity that simple childish statement concealed. Altogether, how would that be possible with Elena married, with another family, with a life built far from the valley? "Isabel," said Elena softly, "it's very late. Why don't you try to sleep a bit more? Tomorrow we'll have all day to talk." The girl seemed about to protest, but a treacherous yawn confirmed the wisdom of the suggestion. She nodded and stood up, but before heading to her room, she did something that took both adults by surprise. She kissed Matteo on the cheek and then Elena, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Good night, Dad." "Good night, Mom Elena," she said with simplicity, and left, leaving behind a silence charged with unexpressed emotions. When the sound of her footsteps faded, Elena closed her eyes for a moment, as if she needed to gather strength for what was to come. "I owe you an explanation," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "Many explanations." Matteo nodded, unable to articulate the 1,000 questions that crowded his mind. Elena stood and walked to the window, turning her back to him. Outside, the full moon bathed the valley with a silvery light that transformed the familiar landscape into something ethereal, almost dreamlike. "I don't know where to start," she confessed. "At the beginning," suggested Matteo, surprising himself with the absence of bitterness in his voice. "Why did you leave without saying goodbye?" Elena turned to look at him, and in her eyes, Matteo saw a pain so deep that it echoed in his own chest. "Because I was young and terrified," she responded with brutal honesty. "When I discovered I was pregnant, my first instinct was to run to you, to share the news. I was scared, yes, but also happy. I imagined your face when you found out, your hands on my belly, our plans for the future." She paused, as if the following words were physically painful to pronounce. But before I could do it, I made the mistake of trusting my mother. I thought she would support me, help me face my father. Instead, she told him everything immediately. Mateo remembered Augusto Montero well, a proud, inflexible landowner, known in the valley as much for his wealth as for his implacable temperament. He gave me an ultimatum, continued Elena. Either I got rid of the baby, or I would be disinherited and expelled from the family. I refused, of course. I told him that you and I would marry, that we would build our own life. Her voice broke as she remembered. That same night while I slept, they sedated me. I woke up on a private plane, headed to a clinic in Switzerland. My father had orchestrated everything, a treatment for a supposed nervous illness that required absolute rest. In reality, it was a discreet place where daughters of wealthy families could give birth away from indiscreet gazes. Mateo felt his blood boil in his veins. The idea of Elena, young and frightened, torn from her home against her will, treated like damaged merchandise that had to be hidden. "Why didn't you try to contact me afterward?" he asked, his voice tense with contained emotion. "When Isabel was born, when you returned..." Elena shook her head. "I didn't return, Mateo. At least not immediately. After the birth, they sent me to Madrid, to the home of distant relatives. My father had orchestrated a marriage with the son of a business partner, a man I had never seen, but who was willing to accept my youthful indiscretion in exchange for family connections and a generous dowry." The bitterness in her voice was palpable. "I refused, of course. I escaped the night before the wedding. For years I lived moving from one place to another, doing temporary jobs, surviving as I could. The only thing that kept me going was the hope of returning someday, of finding you, of recovering our daughter. But you didn't," noted Mateo, struggling against the confusion provoked by this account so different from what he had imagined for years. Elena sat down across from him again, as if the weight of the memories was too much to remain standing. "When I finally gathered the courage and resources to return, 5 years had passed. I came directly to look for you, but the cabin was empty. I was told you had left the valley shortly after my departure, that no one knew where you were. I never left," he declared. "I have lived here uninterruptedly since then." Elena looked at him with surprise. "But your former foreman, Rodrigo, told me..." "Rodrigo was your..." "Father's best friend," interrupted Mateo, beginning to understand. "He fired me a week after you disappeared. He said they didn't need an additional ranch hand. I bought this land with my savings and built the cabin with my own hands." An expression of painful understanding crossed Elena's face. "They lied to both of us," she murmured. "They made you believe I had left of my own will, and me that you had left the valley." The silence that followed was charged with the weight of lost years, of truncated possibilities, of paths they never got to travel together. "And Lara?" asked Mateo finally. "How did she end up raising Isabel?" Elena's expression softened at the mention of her sister. "Lara was the only one who supported me from the beginning. She maintained contact with me in secret during my time in Switzerland, sent me money when I escaped from Madrid, was my connection with Isabel. When I returned and discovered I couldn't find you, I was devastated. I had no resources to support a child, not even a stable place to live." She paused, taking a sip of now-cold tea. "Lara offered to raise Isabel as if she were hers. She had just turned 20, had inherited a small sum from our maternal grandmother, and was willing to break with the family to help me. She said it would be temporary until I could establish myself, but the months turned into years." "And you formed another family," completed Mateo, remembering what Anna had told him. Elena looked him directly in the eyes for the first time since her arrival. "No, Mateo, I don't have another family." The confusion must have shown on his face because Elena continued. "Anna told you I'm married and have 2 children because that's what I've told everyone, including Isabel. It's the story I constructed to explain my long absences, my sporadic visits. The truth is I never married. I never had more children. After you, after us, there was no one else." "But why?" asked Mateo, stunned by this new revelation. "At first because I was too focused on surviving, on building a career that would eventually allow me to recover Isabel. Afterward," she paused, searching for the right words. "Afterward, because I understood that Isabel was better off with Lara. They had a routine, a stable home. My sister gave her what I, always traveling, always struggling to establish myself, couldn't offer her. The tears she had been containing began to slide down her cheeks. Each visit was torture. Seeing my daughter grow through photographs and brief encounters at Christmas or birthdays, pretending to be the fun aunt who brings exotic gifts, hearing her call me Aunt Elena, while my heart broke a little more each time. Matteo extended his hand across the table, an instinctive gesture that surprised them both. Elena, after a moment of hesitation, placed hers on his. The contact, simple and yet deeply intimate, seemed to open a gate that had remained closed for decades. "I'm so sorry, Matteo," she whispered. "Sorry for having robbed you of the opportunity to see your daughter grow. Sorry for not having been braver, more determined. Sorry for all these lost years." Matteo looked at their joined hands on the table, hands that had aged separately, that had carried different burdens, that had learned to live without the consolation of the other. And yet, the contact felt familiar, as if a part of him had always remembered the exact texture of that skin, the particular warmth of that touch. "I'm sorry, too," he finally responded. "Sorry for not having looked for you beyond the valley. Sorry for having accepted your disappearance without questioning the official version. Sorry for having allowed pain to turn me into a hermit, instead of fighting to discover the truth." The silence that followed was no longer the uncomfortable silence of the beginning, but a lighter one, like that which follows a long-postponed confession. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten on the horizon, announcing a new day. "What do we do now?" asked Elena, her voice barely audible. Matteo looked toward the room where Isabel slept, oblivious to the conversation that was redefining the past and future of her parents. "I don't know," he confessed, "but I think that, for the first time in 20 years, there exists an us to decide it." Dawn found Matteo and Elena still in the kitchen, with empty cups in front of them, and years of untold stories floating in the air like motes of dust in the morning light. They had talked for hours, filling the voids that 20 years of separation had created between them. Elena told him about her beginnings as a photographer, about the countries she had visited, about how each place, each face she captured with her camera, seemed to contain an echo of the valley she had left behind. Matteo told her about his life in solitude, about how he had learned to listen to the silent language of trees and animals, about how he had turned wood into confidant and company. The sound of small footsteps interrupted their conversation. Isabel appeared in the doorway, with tousled hair and sleepy eyes, but fully dressed and with an expression of determination that made her seem older than her 8 years. "Good morning," she greeted, observing with curiosity the empty cups and the tired faces of the adults. "Have you been talking all night?" Elena smiled, extending her free hand toward her. "We had a lot to tell each other, little one." Isabel approached and sat in the chair between them, the same one she had occupied hours before. Her eyes, identical to Matteo's, moved from one face to the other, evaluating, understanding more than the adults imagined. "Have you told her about the box?" she asked Matteo. He shook his head. "Not yet. I thought you'd want to show it yourself." Isabel nodded with solemnity and stood up to go get it. As the girl left the kitchen, Elena looked at Matteo with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "The box?" she asked in a low voice. "The one Lara gave her," explained Matteo. "The one that contains—" He couldn't finish because Isabel was already returning, holding the wooden box with reverence. She placed it on the table and opened it slowly, like one who reveals a sacred treasure. "Mom Lara gave it to me when I turned 7, explained the girl. "She said it held secrets I would someday understand." Elena held her breath upon seeing the contents. Her fingers, slightly trembling, brushed the photograph that rested on top. Her and Matteo 20 years ago, under the old oak. "You kept it all this time," she murmured, addressing an absent Lara. Isabel took out the letters tied with the blue ribbon and handed them to Elena. "Dad already read them," she said naturally, as if the word Dad had always been part of her vocabulary. "They're yours, right?" Elena nodded, unable to speak as she untied the small bundle of letters. She recognized her own handwriting, more youthful and hurried than the current one, but unmistakably hers. Letters she had written over the years, some addressed to Matteo, others to Isabel, all entrusted to Lara with the hope that someday they would reach their intended recipients. "I never knew she had preserved them," confessed Elena, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought she kept them in her house." "She wanted me to find them," understood Matteo. That's why she gave the box to Isabel, knowing that sooner or later we would meet. The revelation floated between them. Lara had been the silent guardian of their secrets, the patient architect of a reunion that perhaps she herself had never believed possible. Isabel then took out the last object from the box, the ring with the green stone that Matteo had recognized the night before. "Mom, Lara said this was yours," she said, offering it to Elena, "that someday you would give it to me, when I was older." Elena took the ring between her fingers, contemplating it as if it were an artifact from another time, another life. "Matteo gave it to me the last day we were together," she explained in a soft voice. "I carried it with me to Switzerland, hidden in the hem of my dress. It was the only thing I had of him, my talisman during the months of pregnancy." Her eyes filled with tears. "When you were born, I asked the nurse to put it on a silk cord around your neck so you would carry something of your father with you. But my mother discovered it and took it from me. I thought it was lost forever. Lara must have recovered it," deduced Matteo, "and kept it all these years." Isabel observed the exchange with intensity, absorbing each word, each gesture, constructing in her mind the story of her origins from these fragments that were finally coming together. "Is that why you never told me you were my mom?" she finally asked, addressing Elena with the frankness only children possess. "Because you lost the ring?" The question, so simple and yet so complex, made Elena hold her breath. She looked at Matteo, as if seeking support, and he nodded slightly, encouraging her to respond with honesty. "No, sweetheart," she finally responded, taking Isabel's hands in hers. "I didn't tell you I was your mom, because I was afraid of not being good enough, of not being able to give you the life you deserved, of tearing you away from the stability that Lara offered you." Tears now flowed freely down her face. "Every time I visited you, it hurt to hear you call me Aunt Elena, but I also saw how happy you were with Lara, how secure, how loved, and I told myself it was better that way, that someday when you were older you would understand." Isabel listened with a seriousness inappropriate for her age, her small face reflecting the effort to process such complex truths. "And now," she finally asked, "now can I call you Mum?" The simplicity of the question contrasted with the depth of what it implied. Elena looked at Matteo, whose expression reflected the same uncertainty she felt. How to respond to a question that enclosed so many others? How to define roles and relationships after 20 years of absences and silences? "You can call me whatever makes you feel most comfortable," Elena finally responded. "What's important is that you know the truth. I'm your biological mother. I carried you in my womb, I gave birth to you, and although I couldn't raise you, never, not a single day, did I stop loving you." Isabel nodded, processing the information. "And Mom Lara? Is she also my mom?" "Of course she is," intervened Matteo. "Lara has raised you, cared for you, loved you like a mother since the first day. That doesn't change because you now know the whole truth." The answer seemed to satisfy Isabel, who carefully put the objects back in the wooden box. "So I have two moms and a dad," she concluded, with the simple but irrefutable logic of childhood. "That's more than most of my friends." The declaration drew involuntary smiles from the adults, momentarily lightening the emotional density that filled the kitchen. Matteo stood up and began to prepare breakfast, a concrete activity that allowed him to process everything that had happened while keeping his hands busy. "Will we go see Mom Lara today?" asked Isabel, approaching him to watch how he beat the eggs. "First we need to talk to the doctors," responded Elena. "Know how the transfer went if we can visit her." The sound of a vehicle approaching interrupted the conversation. Matteo looked out the window and recognized Anna's blue car. "It's the teacher," he informed. "She must be coming to take us to the hospital." Anna's arrival added a new layer of complexity to the situation. Upon entering the kitchen and finding Elena already there, her surprise was evident. "Elena, I didn't expect to see you until this afternoon," she commented, exchanging a significant look with Matteo. "Have you been here long?" "Since last night," responded Elena. "I took an earlier flight." Anna nodded, silently evaluating the dynamic. Among the three, her professional gaze caught the reddened eyes, the tired faces, the atmosphere charged with barely contained emotions. "I bring news from the hospital," she announced, accepting the cup of coffee Matteo offered her. "Lara arrived well in the capital. She's in intensive care as planned but stable." Isabel let out a sigh of relief. "Can we go see her?" she asked immediately. Anna exchanged a glance with Elena before responding. Not yet, sweetheart. The doctors want to keep her under strict observation for the next 48 hours. After that, they'll evaluate if she can receive visitors. The disappointment on Isabel's face was evident, but she didn't protest. Instead, she asked, "Do they know if she'll wake up soon?" The silence that followed the question was answer enough. Anna finally leaned toward the girl and took her hands with gentleness. "The doctors are doing everything possible, Isabel. Your mother is a strong woman, but she needs time to heal." Isabel nodded, accepting the explanation with a maturity that moved the adults present. Then she turned to Elena. "When Mom Lara wakes up, will you leave again?" The question, launched with the brutal honesty characteristic of children, hit Elena like a physical punch. For a moment she seemed unable to respond, her face reflecting the interior conflict that tormented her. "I don't know, sweetheart," she finally admitted. "My work—" "Your work is always more important," interrupted Isabel, a flash of pain. Crossing her gaze, "You always leave." The accusation, so simple and yet so accurate, hung in the air like a discordant note. Elena looked at Matteo, seeking help, but he remained silent, understanding that this was a wound that only she could begin to heal. "You're right," recognized Elena after a moment. "I've gone away too many times. I've missed too many important moments in your life, and I can't recover that time." She knelt in front of Isabel to be at the level of her eyes. "But now I'm here, and I can promise you that whatever happens, we'll find a way to be more present in each other's lives. I don't know exactly how it will be, but it will no longer be just sporadic visits and gifts from faraway places." Isabel studied her with the penetrating gaze she had inherited from Matteo, as if evaluating the sincerity of her words. "Do you promise?" "Really?" "I promise," responded Elena, and although her voice trembled slightly, her gaze was firm. "This time is different. This time, we're all here. You, me, your father. And when Lara wakes up, we'll decide together how to move forward." The mention of Matteo made both women look at him, as if seeking confirmation. He, who had observed the exchange in silence, nodded slowly. "We'll find the way," he affirmed, and although his words were few, the weight of his commitment was palpable. Anna, who had witnessed the scene with professional discretion, consulted her watch. "I must go," she announced, standing up. "I have to stop by the school before going to the hospital. Do you need anything?" "We're fine, thank you," responded Matteo, accompanying her to the door. On the threshold, Anna stopped and spoke to him in a low voice. "Social services will send someone this afternoon to evaluate the new situation. With Elena here, things change." Matteo nodded, understanding the implications. Elena's presence, as Isabel's biological mother, altered the temporary arrangements that had been established. For the first time since the girl's appearance in his life, he felt a twinge of anxiety at the possibility of losing her. "Do you think they'll try to take her away?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Anna shook her head. "Not if you present a united front. The girl is clearly attached to both of you, and with Lara in the hospital, the most stable thing for her is to remain with her biological parents." The word parents sounded strange, almost surreal, applied to him and Elena. For 20 years they had been two, strangers united by a truncated past. Now suddenly they were parents. A family, however improbable and unconventional it might be. "Thank you, Anna," he said, briefly squeezing her hand. "For everything." When he returned to the kitchen, he found Elena and Isabel bent over the table, examining something with attention. As he approached, he saw it was the photo album he kept on the highest shelf of the library, a visual record of the years he had spent in the valley. "Look, Mom," exclaimed Isabel, pointing to an image. "This is the old oak you told me about, the one at the lookout." Elena nodded, her fingers brushing the photograph with reverence. "Our special place," she murmured, and raised her gaze to Matteo. "I didn't know it still existed." "It's still standing," he confirmed, older, more twisted, but as strong as ever. Isabel looked at both of them, catching the hidden meaning in that exchange. "Can we go?" she asked with enthusiasm. "Can we go to the oak?" Matteo and Elena exchanged glances. The old oak at the lookout had been their refuge, the silent witness to their youthful love. To return there, after so much time, with their daughter, the idea was as terrifying as it was tempting. "We could go this afternoon," Matteo finally suggested, "after the visit from social services." "Social services?" Matteo briefly explained the situation. The follow-up visits, the evaluation of Isabel's environment, the need to determine custody while Lara remained hospitalized. Then we should prepare, concluded Elena, and in her voice Matteo recognized the determination he had always admired in her. We need to demonstrate that we can offer Isabel a stable home. The word home floated between them, loaded with meanings and implications. What kind of home could two people offer who were barely rediscovering each other after 20 years of separation? How to build stability on such fragile foundations? Isabel, oblivious to these adult concerns, turned the pages of the album with enthusiasm, discovering snippets of her father's life. Matteo with his first horse, Matteo next to the newly built cabin, Matteo carving a wooden figure by the fire. "Why are you always alone in the photos?" she asked with the frankness characteristic of childhood. The question, so simple and direct, left Matteo momentarily speechless. How to explain to an 8-year-old girl the chosen solitude, the fear of abandonment, the invisible scars that had never completely healed? "Because, for a long time," he finally responded, "I thought being alone was safer than risking losing those I loved." Isabel looked at him with that expression of ancient wisdom that sometimes appeared on her childish face. "But now, you're not alone anymore," she declared, and it wasn't a question but an affirmation. Matteo looked at the girl, at Elena, and finally around the kitchen that for so many years had witnessed his solitary breakfasts. The space, without having physically changed, felt different, warmer, more alive, as if it had awakened from a long lethargy. "No," he confirmed, feeling something inside him loosen, a tension he had maintained for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to live without it. "Now, I'm not alone anymore." The social worker's visit went better than expected. Mrs. Peralta, with her grey suit and her clipboard of notes, toured the cabin with a critical eye but found nothing to object to. Isabel's room was clean and orderly, the refrigerator well stocked, the first aid kit complete. Elena's presence, who officially introduced herself as Isabel's biological mother, seemed to considerably simplify the procedures. "I understand the situation is unconventional," commented Mrs. Peralta as she completed her report at the kitchen table. "But the child's welfare is our priority, and it's evident that Isabel feels safe and loved here." She paused, looking alternately at Matteo and Elena. "However, we will need to establish a formal custody agreement. While Mrs. Montero remains hospitalized, have you discussed long-term arrangements?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Elena and Matteo exchanged glances, aware that they had not yet addressed that conversation as necessary as it was complex. "We're working on that," Elena finally responded. "The important thing now is to provide stability to Isabel during my sister's recovery." Mrs. Peralta nodded, apparently satisfied with the answer. "I'll return in a week for a follow-up," she announced, closing her folder. "Meanwhile, keep the department informed about any change in Mrs. Montero's condition." When the social worker left, Isabel came out of her room where she had been drawing during the interview. Her expression was hopeful. "Can we go to the Oak now?" Matteo checked his watch. The afternoon was beginning to wane, tinting the valley with that golden light that made everything seem softer, closer, more real. "It's a good time," he confirmed. "The light will be perfect when we reach the lookout." The path to the Old Oak was a narrow trail that wound up the hillside. Matteo and Elena walked on either side of Isabel, occasionally extending a hand to help her on the steeper stretches. They didn't talk much, each immersed in their own thoughts, in their own memories of the last time they had walked that path together. Isabel, however, filled the silence with questions and observations, pointing out birds, wildflowers, stones with curious shapes. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and gradually the tension that had accompanied the adults since their departure dissipated, replaced by a lighter, almost jubilant atmosphere. "Is it much farther?" asked Isabel for the third time, stopping to catch her breath. "We're almost there," responded Matteo, pointing to a bend in the path. "As soon as we pass that curve, we'll see it." And so it was. Upon rounding the last bend, the landscape opened before them, as if an invisible hand had drawn back a curtain. The lookout was a natural ledge on the hillside, a stone balcony that offered a panoramic view of the entire valley, and dominating it all, the old oak, its trunk gnarled and twisted by the years, its branches extended like open arms toward the sky. its abundant green foliage whispering secrets to the wind. Eleanor stopped in her tracks, as if the vision had physically struck her. Her eyes roamed the place hungrily, drinking in every detail, comparing it with the memory preserved for 20 years. "It's exactly as I remembered it," she murmured, as if time hadn't passed at all. Matteo observed her in silence, noting the small changes in her expression, the way her eyes moistened, the way her hands trembled slightly. And for the first time since her return, he clearly saw the Elena he had loved, not the sophisticated photographer who had returned from exile, but the young woman of easy laughter and dreamy eyes he had known under that same oak so many summers ago. Isabel, oblivious to the moment of revelation her parents were experiencing, ran toward the tree with the simple joy of childhood. Her small hands touched the rough bark with reverence. "It's huge!" she exclaimed, looking up at the branches that extended far above her head. "How old is it?" "More than 200 years, they say," responded Matteo, approaching. "It was already old when my grandfather was a child." Elena followed them slowly, as if each step required a conscious effort. When she finally reached the oak, her fingers brushed the bark next to Isabel's, and then rose to a specific point on the trunk, at the height of her shoulder. "Here it is," she said in a soft, almost reverent voice. Matteo approached to see what had caught her attention. Carved into the bark, partially deformed by the tree's growth but still legible, were their initials, EM plus MS. "You carved them the first time we came here," remembered Elena, her fingers tracing the letters as if she could read their history through touch. "You said that way our names would grow together with the tree forever," Isabel observed, fascinated, this tangible testimony to her parents' shared past. "Can I carve my name too?" she asked, looking alternately at Matteo and Elena. Matteo took out his pocket knife, the same one he had used 20 years ago to engrave those initials. He opened it and held it for a moment, evaluating its weight, connecting present and past through the worn metal. "The oak is a living being," he explained, kneeling beside Isabel. "Each mark we make on it is a small wound. That's why we only carve something when it's really important, something we want to endure longer than ourselves." Isabel nodded, understanding the seriousness of the moment. "It is important," she affirmed. "We're a family now." The simplicity of the declaration contrasted with the depth of what it implied. Matteo looked at Elena, seeking her approval, and she nodded, her eyes bright with contained tears. With careful movements, Matteo guided Isabel's hand as they carved together her initials. IMS, Isabel Montero Suarez, just below the originals. "Now the tree will remember all three of us," declared the girl with satisfaction, passing her fingers over the newly engraved letters. They sat under the shade of the oak, contemplating the valley that stretched at their feet. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, tinting the landscape with reddish and golden hues. From that height, they could see the village, the river that crossed it like a silver ribbon, and beyond, the road that led to the capital where Lara was fighting to wake up. "It was our secret place," commented Elena, her gaze lost on the horizon. "We came here when we wanted to escape from everything and everyone, especially from your father," added Matteo, remembering the elaborate strategies they developed to avoid being discovered. Eleanor smiled with melancholy. "He was so stubborn, so blind in his pride. He never understood that he couldn't control my heart as he controlled his lands and his workers." "Grandfather Augusto?" asked Isabel, surprising both adults with her knowledge of the name. "Mom Lara told me about him. She said he was a very important man, but that he didn't know how to see what was truly important." Elena and Matteo exchanged glances. Lara's wisdom, transmitted through Isabel, left them speechless. "Your mother, Lara, was always the most perceptive of the three siblings," Elena finally commented. "Santiago, the oldest, was like my father, ambitious, stubborn, focused on power and money. I was the rebel, the one who questioned everything, but without the maturity to offer alternatives. Lara was the patient one, the observer, the one who understood people beyond their words." "She's like you," noted Matteo, addressing Isabel. "You have that same gift for seeing inside people." Isabel smiled, pleased by the comparison. "Do I look like you too?" she asked, looking at Eleanor with a mixture of hope and curiosity. Elena studied her daughter's face as if trying to memorize every detail. "You have my nose," she finally responded, "and something in the shape of your mouth when you smile. But your eyes are Dad's, completed Isabel, turning to Matteo. Forest Green, Mom Lara says. The silence that followed was charged with contained emotions, with untold stories, with barely glimpsed possibilities. The sun sank lower and lower on the horizon, casting elongated shadows over the valley. We should return before it gets dark, suggested Matteo, standing up. Elena nodded, but before getting up, she removed the necklace she was wearing, a simple chain from which hung a small silver charm in the shape of a camera. This is for you, she said, placing it around Isabel's neck. I bought it on my first trip as a professional photographer in Paris. It has accompanied me on every adventure since then. Isabel touched the charm with reverence. Can I really keep it? Really, confirmed Elena. That way you'll have something of mine with you always, even when I can't be present. The implication that there would continue to be separations floated between them like a cloud momentarily darkening the sun. Matteo felt it with special intensity, understanding that Elena, with her international career, her commitments, her life built far from the valley, was not offering complete permanence. Isabel seemed to capture it too, because her next question was direct as, "Only children know how to be. When will you leave again?" Elena paled slightly. "I don't know for certain," she admitted. "I have commitments, a job, but things will be different now, I promise you. We'll find a way to be more present in each other's lives." Isabel nodded, but her expression had become more serious, as if she understood that adult reality rarely conformed to childish desires for permanence and security. The descent from the hill took place in a denser silence than that of the ascent. The magic of the reunion under the oak had given way to the reality of the decisions they had to make, of the pending conversations, of the practical arrangements they would have to negotiate. When they reached the cabin, the phone was ringing. Matteo hurried to answer, while Elena and Isabel sat on the porch, exhausted from the walk and the emotions of the day. It was Anna, Matteo informed upon returning, his expression inscrutable. "There's news of Lara." Elena stood up immediately, anxiety visible in every line of her body. "Is she?" she began, unable to complete the question. "She's awake," responded Matteo, and a smile began to form on his lips. "She woke up an hour ago. The doctors say she's disoriented, but conscious and stable." A collective sigh ran through the small congregation. Isabel jumped from her seat with a cry of joy. "Mom, Lara woke up," she exclaimed, hugging Matteo and then Elena. "We have to go see her." "Tomorrow," promised Matteo. "Anna has offered to take us as soon as the doctors authorize visits." The news transformed the atmosphere of the cabin. Dinner passed amid enthusiastic plans for the trip to the capital, speculations about Lara's recovery, and a general sense of relief that dissipated previous tensions. Only later, when Isabel finally fell asleep, exhausted by the day's emotions, could Matteo and Elena talk alone in the kitchen, with cups of tea between their hands and 20 years of silence still to be completely broken. "What will happen when Lara recovers?" Matteo finally asked, giving voice to the question that had been floating between them since the news of the awakening. Elena looked at the contents of her cup, as if she could find answers in the dark liquid. "I don't know," she admitted. "Everything has happened so fast. Just a few days ago, my life was following its normal course. Now you're here," completed Matteo. "With your daughter. With me." Elena looked up, and in her eyes, Matteo saw the reflection of his own uncertainty. "With you," she repeated, and the words seemed to contain meanings that neither of them was prepared to fully explore. "After so much time, after so many changes, who are we to each other now, Matteo?" The question hung between them, loaded with unexpressed possibilities and fears. Matteo extended his hand across the table, an echo of the gesture he had made the night before. This time Elena intertwined her fingers with his without hesitation. "We are Isabel's parents," he finally responded. "We are two people who once loved each other deeply, and whom destiny has reunited. The rest we'll have to discover day by day." Elena nodded, squeezing his hand slightly. "Day by day," she repeated, and in her voice there was an implicit promise. "I think I can live with that." The central hospital in the capital was a labyrinth of white corridors, hurried personnel, and the smell of disinfectant. Matteo, Elena, Isabel, and Anna followed through that maze, each immersed in their own thoughts and expectations about the reunion with Lara. Isabel walked between her parents, holding a hand of each. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers she had collected that morning in the surroundings of the cabin, carefully wrapped in tissue paper. Her expression oscillated between excitement and nervousness. "Do you think she'll recognize me?" she asked in a low voice, looking at Eleanor. "Of course she will," she responded, gently squeezing her hand. "You're her little one. Nothing could make her forget that." The doctor who received them in the intensive care unit was a middle-aged man with a tired but kind expression. He explained the situation while leading them to Lara's room. "She has experienced what we call traumatic amnesia," he explained. "It's quite common in cases of brain injuries like hers. Her most recent memories, especially those of the day of the accident, are fragmented or absent, but her basic cognitive functions seem intact." "Will she recover completely?" asked Matteo, aware that Isabel was listening attentively to every word. The doctor made an ambiguous gesture with his hand. "The brain is a complex and mysterious organ. Some patients recover memory completely, others only partially. The important thing now is not to pressure her. Allow the memories to return at their own pace." He stopped in front of a closed door and looked at them seriously. "One more thing. She's physically weak. The trauma, the surgery, the prolonged coma, they've taken their toll. Don't be alarmed by her appearance. Focus on the fact that she's awake and on the path to recovery." With these words, he opened the door and invited them to enter. The room was small but bright, with a window overlooking an interior garden. In the bed, semi-reclined on pillows, was Lara. The first impression was shocking. The woman they remembered, of naturally thin constitution, seemed to have shrunk even more. Her face was pale, with marked dark circles, and her hair, once long and shiny, had been partially shaved for surgery. But her eyes, those dark eyes so similar to Elena's, were open and alert. Upon seeing them enter, a weak but genuine smile transformed her face. "Isabel," she murmured, extending a trembling hand. The girl released her parents and ran to the bed, barely containing the impulse to throw herself on her mother. Carefully, she placed the bouquet of flowers in her lap and took the extended hand in hers. "Mom," she whispered, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "I knew you would wake up. I told everyone." Lara caressed her daughter's face with slow movements, as if memorizing each feature through touch. "My brave one," she responded, her voice hoarse from disuse. "My little brave one." Her gaze then moved to the adults who remained near the door. When she saw Eleanor, her eyes opened wider. "You came," she said simply. Eleanor approached the bed, emotion visible in every line of her body. "Of course I came," she responded, leaning to kiss her sister's forehead. "Nothing could keep me away." The two sisters looked at each other intensely, communicating in that silent language they had developed since childhood. Finally, Lara smiled. "You're here," she repeated, and then her gaze moved to Matteo, who remained a step back. "And you too." Matteo approached, uncomfortable under the intensity of Lara's gaze. "I'm glad to see you awake," he said, and although the words were simple, the emotion that accompanied them was palpable. Lara observed the three of them, Elena, Matteo, Isabel, as if Lara observed the three of them, Elena, Matteo, Isabel, as if she were completing a puzzle in her mind. "The box," she said finally, addressing Isabel. "Did you find it?" Isabel nodded vigorously. "Yes, Mom, and the photograph, and the letters. I showed them to Dad and Mum, Eleanor." Lara closed her eyes for a moment, as if she needed to process the implication of those words. When she opened them again, she looked directly at Matteo. "I knew she would find you," she said with a quiet certainty. "From the first day she arrived in the valley, I knew that sooner or later your paths would cross." Matteo felt a wave of gratitude toward this woman who had sacrificed so much, who had kept their secrets, who had raised his daughter as her own while keeping alive the hope of a reunion. "Thank you," he said, and the words seemed insufficient to express all he felt, for taking care of her, for loving her, for keeping us alive in her memory. Lara shook her head slightly. "Don't thank me," she responded. "Isabel has been the greatest gift of my life. Every day with her has been a blessing." The sincerity in her voice was undeniable. There was no resentment, no sense of sacrifice, only pure and simple love for the girl she had raised. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, taking her sister's free hand. "How do you really feel?" she asked, studying her face with concern. "Don't sugarcoat the truth for us." Lara smiled weakly. Like I've been run over by a train, she admitted. Everything hurts. My head is full of holes. There are entire days I can't remember, but I'm alive. And you're all here. It's more than I dared to hope for. Isabel, who had been listening attentively, intervened. You're going to get well, Mum. And when you're better, we'll all go back to the valley together. Dad, Mom Elena, you and me. We'll be a family. The simplicity of the declaration contrasted with the complexity it implied. The three adults exchanged glances, each aware of the pending conversations, of the decisions they still had to make. It sounds wonderful, sweetheart, responded Lara, stroking Isabel's hair. But first, I need to recover, and your parents need time to adapt to this new situation. The wisdom in her words didn't go unnoticed by Matteo and Elena. Even from a hospital bed, weakened by weeks in a coma, Lara continued to be the voice of reason, the one who saw beyond immediate emotions to practical complexities. The doctor returned then, indicating that the visiting time was over. The patient needs to rest, he explained, though his tone was kind. You can return tomorrow if you wish. Isabel hugged her mother carefully, promising to return the next day with more flowers and drawings. Elena kissed her sister's forehead, whispering something in her ear that made Lara smile. Matteo, after a moment of hesitation, leaned over and gently squeezed her hand. Thank you, he repeated, because he couldn't find other words that could adequately express what he felt. Lara nodded, understanding all that he wasn't saying. Take care of them, she responded simply. Both of them. Outside the room, while they waited for the elevator, Isabel expressed what everyone was thinking. She's very thin, and she looks tired. Elena knelt to be at her height. Yes, sweetheart. She's been through a lot, but she's strong, like you. She'll recover. Isabel nodded, processing the information with that seriousness that occasionally made her seem much older than her 8 years. Can we stay in the city until she's better? She asked, looking alternately at Elena and Matteo. I don't want to go home without her. The question raised immediate practical issues. Where would they stay? For how long? What would happen with the ranch, the animals, the responsibilities that Matteo had temporarily left behind? We'll find a place to stay, responded Elena, making the decision for both of them. At least for a few days until the doctors give us a clearer prognosis. Matteo nodded, though internally he was calculating all the tasks he would need to organize, finding someone to care for the animals, securing the cabin, preparing a bag with essentials for Isabel and himself. Anna, who had remained discreetly to one side during the visit, offered to help. I know a small apartment near the hospital that rents by the week, she said, and I can contact Javier to take care of the ranch. His children would be delighted to look after Tormenta. The relief on Matteo's face was evident. I would appreciate that very much, he responded, aware of how much they now depended on the generosity of this woman they barely knew. The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of activity. They returned to the valley to collect what was necessary, arranged for the care of the ranch, and by the afternoon they were back in the capital, settling into a small but cozy apartment. 2 streets from the hospital. The space was limited. A main bedroom, a small study that could be converted into a bedroom, a kitchen dining room, and a bathroom. Elena insisted that Matteo and Isabel take the main bedroom while she accommodated herself in the study. The forced proximity created an intimacy that none had anticipated, but that strangely didn't feel uncomfortable. That night, after putting Isabel to bed, Matteo found Elena on the small balcony, contemplating the city lights with a thoughtful expression. What are you thinking about? He asked, leaning on the railing beside her. Elena smiled slightly. About how strange destiny is, she responded. A week ago, I was in Buenos Aires, photographing a fashion show, convinced that my life would continue on the same predictable course until the end. And now you're here, completed Matteo. With a daughter you barely know and a... He stopped, unsure how to define himself in relation to her. A past love that I never managed to forget, completed Elena, looking him directly in the eyes. The honesty of the declaration surprised them both. It was the first time since their reunion that either of them had explicitly mentioned what they had once meant to each other. Elena, began Matteo, but she raised a hand to stop him. I don't expect anything, Matteo, she said softly. 20 years have passed. We're different people now. The only thing that unites us with certainty is Isabel, and it's on her that we should focus. Matteo nodded, although part of him wanted to protest, wanted to say that perhaps, just perhaps, there could be more between them than the shared bond with their daughter. But Elena was right. It was too soon, too fragile, too complicated. "Lara told me something interesting before we left," he commented instead, slightly changing the subject. "When everyone else had left the room, she asked me to stay a moment." Elena looked at him with curiosity. "What did she tell you?" "She said, 'Don't let her escape this time. 20 years is too long to be apart.'" The silence that followed was charged with unexpressed possibilities, with paths they might take, with decisions they would eventually have to face. "Lara has always been the romantic in the family," Eleanor finally commented, though her voice trembled slightly. "Even from a hospital bed, she's still trying to fix lives." "It's an admirable quality," responded Matteo, "especially after everything she's been through." Elena nodded, turning her gaze back to the urban horizon, so different from the rural landscape to which they were both accustomed. "Do you think we could make it work?" she asked after a long silence. "A family, the 3 of us, or the 4 of us, with Lara?" The question enclosed so many complexities, so many variables, so many fears and hopes intertwined. "I don't know," responded Matteo with honesty, "but I think we should try, for Isabel, and perhaps also for ourselves." Elena turned toward him, and in the penumbra of the balcony, with the city lights as silent witnesses, her eyes shone with a mixture of vulnerability and determination. "I'm afraid, Matteo," she confessed. "Afraid of failing, afraid of not being the mother Isabel needs, afraid of not being able to balance this new life with the career that has cost me so much to build." Matteo understood then, perhaps for the first time completely, the sacrifice that Elena was contemplating. For 20 years, she had built an identity, a career, an independent life, and now suddenly she found herself facing the possibility of altering all that for a family she was just beginning to know. "You don't have to give up everything," he said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "We can find a balance. Maybe it won't be conventional, maybe it will require adjustments from all of us, but it's possible." "Do you really believe that?" asked Elena, and there was so much hope in her voice that Matteo felt a tightness in his chest. "I believe it," he affirmed. "And if there's something I've learned in these weeks, it's that life can surprise us when we least expect it." Eleanor smiled, and in that smile, Matteo saw an echo of the young woman he had loved under the old oak at the lookout. "Day by day," she repeated, remembering their agreement from the night before. "One step at a time. One step at a time," confirmed Matteo, and without thinking too much, he extended his hand toward her. Elena took it. Without hesitation, intertwining her fingers with his, they remained like that in silence, contemplating the city lights, each immersed in their own thoughts, but united by that simple yet deeply significant contact. A new beginning, thought Matteo, not a repetition of the past, but something completely new, built on the foundations of what they once were, but looking toward the future. A future that, for the first time in 20 years, seemed full of possibilities instead of memories. The days in the capital established a routine that, though temporary, began to feel strangely familiar. The mornings were dedicated to visiting Lara, whose recovery progressed slowly but steadily. The afternoons were for Isabel, walks in the nearby park, visits to museums, small excursions that allowed her to discover the city without overwhelming her. The nights, when the girl slept, belonged to Matteo and Elena. Conversations on the balcony, shared memories, tentative plans for a future they were just beginning to envision. A week after their arrival, the doctors announced that Lara could be discharged in a few days, though she would need rehabilitation therapy and regular checkups. "Does that mean we can go back home?" asked Isabel, who, despite enjoying the urban adventures, missed the valley, the open spaces, the freedom of the ranch. "Soon," promised Elena, while helping her sister eat the hospital lunch's gelatin. "But your mother will need special care at first. We have to make sure everything is prepared." Lara, who had been listening in silence, intervened. "I don't want to be a burden," she said, her voice stronger than in the first days, but still tired. "I can stay here, in the capital, close to the hospital." "No way," responded Elena firmly. "You'll return to the valley with us. The fresh air, the tranquility, the nature, they'll help you recover faster than this sterile environment." Matteo, who had remained in the background during the conversation, added, "The cabin is small, but we can adapt the porch to make it more accessible, and my bedroom is on the ground floor." The implications of this offer hung in the air. If Lara occupied Matteo's room, where would he sleep? The question, not formulated but present in the minds of all the adults, was answered by Isabel with the direct logic of childhood. "Dad can sleep with Mom Elena. That way, we'll all have a place." The silence that followed this declaration was brief, but loaded with meaning. Elena and Matteo exchanged glances, both blushing slightly. Lara, observing the scene from her bed, sketched a tired but amused smile. "From the mouths of babes," she murmured. The day of medical discharge finally arrived. Lara, dressed in clothes that Elena had bought for her, her own garments had been destroyed in the flood, seemed fragile but determined as the nurse helped her sit in the wheelchair that was hospital protocol for departing patients. "I don't need this," she protested weakly, although her previous attempts to walk more than a few steps had demonstrated that her body had not yet recovered all its strength. "It's just to the car," Elena reassured her. "After that, you can demonstrate how stubborn you are by trying to do more than you should." The journey back to the valley was silent. Lara, exhausted by the effort of leaving the hospital, dozed in the back seat with her head resting on Isabel's shoulder, who watched her with a mixture of concern and joy. Matteo drove, concentrated on the road, while Elena looked out the window, contemplating the landscape that was gradually transforming from urban to rural. Upon arriving at the ranch, they found a surprise waiting for them. Ana, Javier, and several villagers had worked during the last few days to adapt the cabin to Lara's needs. They had built a ramp on the porch, reorganized the furniture to create wider spaces, and even installed support bars in the bathroom. "We didn't know exactly when you would return," explained Ana, as they helped Lara settle into what had been Matteo's room. "But we wanted everything to be ready." Everyone's gratitude was palpable. This type of solidarity, of community care, was precisely what made Valle de las Rosas special, reflected Matteo. Despite his tendency toward isolation during the last 20 years, deep down he had always appreciated this aspect of the place he had chosen as home. The neighbors left at nightfall, leaving behind a refrigerator full of prepared food, fresh flowers in improvised vases, and the promise to return to help with whatever was necessary. The family, suddenly alone in the cabin that now seemed smaller than ever, faced the reality of their new situation. "Well," said Elena, once Isabel had fallen asleep and Lara was resting in her new room, "I suppose we have to decide the sleeping arrangements." They were in the kitchen, preparing tea in a ritual that had become familiar during the days in the capital. Matteo looked at her, appreciating the way the oil lamp's light softened her features, giving her an almost ethereal appearance. "I can sleep on the sofa," he offered, "or in the barn if necessary. The sofa is too small for you, and the barn is full of drafts. It's not a long-term solution." "What do you suggest then?" asked Matteo, though he suspected the answer. Eleanor took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "Isabel is right," she finally said. "The most practical thing would be for us to share a room. The bed is big enough, and it wouldn't be the first time that—" She stopped, blushing slightly at the implication of her own words. 20 years ago, they had shared not only a bed, but also dreams, plans, intimacies that now seemed to belong to other people. "Just for sleeping," she clarified quickly. "I'm not suggesting—" "I understand," interrupted Matteo, sparing her the explanation. "And you're right. It is the most practical solution." Practicality, however, didn't diminish the strangeness of the situation. That night, as they prepared for bed, the discomfort was palpable. They took turns using the bathroom, avoided looking directly at each other while changing, and finally lay down, each at one end of the bed, maintaining a careful distance between them. "Good night," murmured Elena, turning her back to him. "Good night," responded Matteo, looking at the ceiling with his arms crossed over his chest. The silence that followed was charged with unresolved tension, with unasked questions, with barely acknowledged desires. Matteo could hear Elena's breathing, rhythmic but not entirely relaxed, and knew she was as awake as he was. "This is ridiculous," Elena finally said, turning to look at him. "We're adults. We have a daughter together. We've slept in the same bed for a week in the capital. Why is it suddenly so uncomfortable?" Matteo turned to face her. In the penumbra, Barely illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the curtains, he could distinguish the outline of her face, the curve of her cheek, the shine of her eyes. "Because now it's different," he responded. "Before it was temporary, a practical solution while we were in the city. Now it seems more permanent." Elena nodded, understanding. "And permanent is scary," she completed, "because it means commitments, decisions, real changes in our lives." "Exactly." Silence settled between them again, but this time it was different, more reflective than tense. "What do you want, Matteo?" Elena finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Not for Isabel, not for Lara, but for you. What do you want from your life now?" The question took him by surprise. For so many years, his personal desires had taken a back seat, buried under layers of routine and self-imposed solitude. Now, directly confronted with the question, he discovered he didn't have a clear answer. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "For 20 years, my life has been this ranch, the animals, the wood. I didn't allow myself to want anything more. And now suddenly there are so many possibilities." He paused, ordering his thoughts. "But I know I want to be a good father to Isabel. I want to make up for the lost years. And I want—" He stopped, unsure if he should express the desire that had begun to form in his heart since the reunion. "What do you want?" insisted Eleanor, moving slightly closer. "I want to see where this takes us," he finally responded, making a gesture that encompassed the space between them. "You and me, not as we were before, but as we are now. Adults who have lived, who have grown, who have changed. I want to discover if there still exists something between us worth exploring." The honesty of the declaration hung in the air between them. Elena looked at him for a long time, as if she were evaluating not only his words but everything behind them, his fears, his hopes, his barely revealed vulnerability. "I want that too," she finally responded. "But I'm afraid, Matteo, afraid that we're reliving the past instead of building something new. Afraid that the intensity of these days, the reunion with Isabel, Lara's situation, everything is clouding our judgment." Matteo nodded, perfectly understanding her fears, because they were also his. "What if we take it slow?" he suggested. "Day by day, as we agreed, without pressure, without definitive expectations, just seeing what happens." Elena smiled in the darkness. "Day by day," she repeated. "I like that plan." With this tacit understanding, the tension between them dissipated, replaced by a complicity that, though new, had echoes of their old connection. Elena moved a little closer, not invading Matteo's space, but reducing the carefully maintained distance until then. "Good night, Matteo," she said, and this time her voice contained a warmth that had been absent in her first attempt. "Good night, Eleanor," he responded, allowing himself to relax for the first time since they had lain down. Sleep arrived surprisingly quickly after that, as if the conversation had released a tension that neither had fully recognized until then. The next morning, they woke to find Isabel sitting at the foot of the bed, observing them with an expression of satisfaction that suggested her plans were working exactly as she had hoped. "Good morning," she greeted cheerfully. "Mom Lara is already awake. She says she's hungry." The naturalness with which the girl accepted the new situation, her parents sharing a room, her adoptive mother recovering in the house, all together under the same roof, was both a relief and a lesson. For Isabel, family was not a rigid construction defined by social conventions, but simply the people who loved and cared for each other, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. The following days established a new routine. Matteo continued taking care of the ranch, but now with the enthusiastic help of Isabel, who had discovered a natural affinity for working with animals. Elena divided her time between caring for Lara, whose recovery was progressing slowly, and photography sessions in the valley, rediscovering with professional eyes the beauty of the place she had left behind so many years ago. The nights belonged to the four of them. Shared dinners at the kitchen table, board games rescued from the attic, stories told by the fire. And later, when Isabel and Lara slept, Matteo and Elena had their time alone. Conversations on the porch under the stars. Comfortable. Silence is shared, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, a physical rediscovery of each other. A brush of hands while passing the salt. A hug that lasted a second longer than necessary. A sustained look across the table. Small gestures that were building a bridge over the 20-year abyss that had separated them. And in the intimacy of the shared bedroom, the initial distance was reduced night after night. What began as two people sharing a space out of practical necessity gradually transformed into a reunion of bodies that, despite the time elapsed, remembered the ancient dance of desire. It was Elena who took the first step, on a particularly cold night when physical closeness was both comfort and necessity. "Matteo," she whispered in the darkness, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire in the living room fireplace. "Yes," he responded, completely awake despite the late hour. "Can I—" she began, and instead of completing the question, she moved closer until her body brushed against his. Matteo responded by embracing her, drawing her to him with a naturalness that surprised them both. The shared warmth, the synchronized rhythm of their breathing, the forgotten and rediscovered familiarity of their bodies. Everything combined in a moment of intimacy that needed no words. They didn't make love that night, nor the next. There was a tacit agreement between them that that step, when it came, would not be rushed or casual. It would be the culmination of a process of rediscovery, of rebuilt trust, of a new understanding between adults who had lived, suffered, and grown along separate paths. Meanwhile, spring advanced in the valley. The fields covered themselves with wildflowers, the trees burst into green buds, and the old oak at the lookout, silent witness to so many crucial moments in their lives, deployed its foliage with renewed vigor. One afternoon, while Lara rested and Matteo worked in the barn, Elena took Isabel to the lookout. They walked slowly, respecting the girl's pace, stopping to identify plants, observe birds, collect interesting stones that Isabel kept in her pockets like small treasures. Upon reaching the oak, Elena took out her camera. It was the first time she had formally photographed her daughter. Not just casual snapshots, but thought-out portraits, compositions that sought to capture the essence of this girl who was and wasn't herself, who was and wasn't Matteo, who was unique and perfect in her individuality. Isabel posed first with shyness, then with growing confidence, and finally with the overflowing joy that characterized her. She ran around the tree, climbed its lower branches, reclined among its roots, as if the old oak were a lifelong friend. "Look, Mum," she called at one point, pointing to the initials carved in the bark. "They're growing with the tree, like you said." Elena approached, focusing her camera on the marks that time and nature had begun to integrate into the living texture of the bark. EM plus MS, and below more recent IMS. The past, the present, and the future intertwined in the living wood. "Yes," she confirmed, capturing the image. "They grow with it, like us." That night, after Isabel fell asleep, Elena showed the photographs to Matteo on her camera screen. He observed them in silence, marveling at Elena's ability to capture not only the physical image of their daughter, but something deeper, her spirit, her character, the inner light that made her unique. "They're beautiful," he finally said. "You have a gift." Elena smiled, pleased by the compliment. "I've had a good model," she responded. "Isabel is photogenic in a way that goes beyond the physical. There's something in her that responds to the camera, that reveals itself to the lens. Like you," noted Matteo. "I remember how you transformed when I photographed you with that old camera I had. It was as if a deeper, truer version of you emerged for the lens." The memory transported them both to those distant summers when they were young, and the future seemed so full of possibilities. "I was 18, murmured Elena, as if speaking to herself. "I was so sure of everything, so convinced I could defy the whole world for love." "And you did," responded Matteo. "In your way. You survived the exile, built a life, a career. You didn't allow them to destroy you." Elena looked at him, surprised by this perspective on her past decisions. "I never saw it that way," she admitted. "I always thought I had failed, that I hadn't fought hard enough for us, for our daughter." "You fought in the only way you could then," responded Matteo, and in his voice there was no reproach, only understanding. "And now you're here. That's what matters." They looked at each other in the penumbra of the room, two people who had traveled separate paths for so long that the reunion seemed almost miraculous. And perhaps it was, thought Matteo, an everyday miracle made of small decisions, of coincidences, of the stubborn persistence of love through time and distance. "Do you know what day tomorrow is?" Elena suddenly asked. Matteo shook his head. May 15th, she responded. The anniversary of the photograph, of our last day together before... She didn't need to complete the phrase. Both knew what had happened afterward. The forced separation, the hidden pregnancy, the birth in exile, 20 years of absence. We should do something, suggested Matteo. Not to remember the separation, but to celebrate the reunion. Elena smiled, and in that smile Matteo saw an echo of the young woman she had been, but also the strength and wisdom of the woman she had become. I have an idea, she said, but I'll need your help, and Isabel's. May 15th dawned with a special clarity, as if the entire valley had been washed during the night. The air had that crystalline quality that makes each color seem more intense, each sound sharper, each aroma more defined. Elena had risen before dawn, moving, silently so as not to wake Matteo. She had dressed simply but with care. A white linen dress, leather sandals, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, adorned with small wildflowers. When Matteo woke up, she was no longer in the room. He found her in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with Isabel, who seemed to have been initiated into some secret that made her smile with complicity every time she looked at her father. "Good morning," greeted Matteo, intrigued by the festive atmosphere that seemed to fill the cabin. "What are you two plotting?" "It's a surprise," responded Isabel, exchanging a look with Eleanor. "But first you must have breakfast." Breakfast turned out to be a true celebration. Pancakes with fresh honey, fruits cut into elaborate shapes, freshly ground coffee. Even Lara, who normally took her breakfast in the bedroom, joined them at the table, helped by Elena. "I feel like it's my birthday," commented Matteo, accepting another cup of coffee. "Is anyone going to explain to me what's going on?" The three women exchanged complicit looks. "All in good time," responded Elena, and there was something in her voice, a note of contained anticipation that awakened Matteo's curiosity even more. After breakfast, Isabel disappeared into her room and returned with a package wrapped in plain paper, tied with a jute string. "For you, Dad," she said, offering it to him solemnly. Matteo took it, surprised by the unexpected weight. Upon opening it, he found new clothes, dark jeans, a white cotton shirt, a soft leather vest. "It's so you look handsome today," explained Isabel with the frankness that characterized her. "Mom Elena said you needed something special for the occasion." Matteo looked at Elena, who was observing the scene with a mixture of amusement and something else, something deeper that he couldn't completely identify. "What occasion exactly?" he asked, holding the new clothes as if they were an unknown object. "You'll know soon," responded Elena. "Now go change. We have a busy day ahead." Obediently, Matteo withdrew to the bedroom to put on the new clothes. They fit him perfectly, as if Elena had memorized his exact measurements during the shared nights. Looking at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. The man who looked back at him seemed younger, more vital, as if the years of solitude had begun to fade from his face. When he returned to the living room, he found all three waiting for him. Lara, seated in the armchair, with a simple but elegant dress and a shawl over her shoulders. Isabel, resplendent in a blue dress that matched the camera necklace Elena had given her. And Elena, radiant in her white dress, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers tied with a blue ribbon. "Ready for our surprise?" she asked, extending her free hand toward him. Matteo took it, feeling the warmth of her fingers intertwined with his. "I absolutely have no idea what's going on," he confessed. "But yes, I'm ready." Elena smiled, and in that smile, Matteo saw the young woman he had loved and the woman she had become, superimposed like two transparent photographs that together formed a more complete, truer image. "Let's go then," she said. "They're waiting for us." "They're waiting for us?" repeated Matteo, increasingly confused. "Who?" His question went unanswered as they left the cabin. Outside, to his surprise, he found Tormenta saddled and two other horses he recognized as belonging to Javier. Next to them waited Ana, formally dressed and holding the reins. "Good morning," she greeted, with a smile that suggested she too was part of the conspiracy. "The carriage for Mrs. Montero is ready." She pointed to a small carriage, clearly adapted to transport someone with limited mobility, hitched to a gentle horse that Matteo recognized as one of the most docile from Javier's stable. "Is anyone going to explain to me what's happening?" he asked again, while helping Lara into the carriage with Anna's support. "Patience," responded Lara. settling into the padded seat. All in good time. Isabel mounted with Anna, who would take the reins of the carriage. Elena approached Tormenta, caressing her neck with a familiarity that surprised Matteo. "She seems to remember you," he commented, observing how the mare, normally wary with strangers, responded positively to Elena's touch. "Animals have better memory than people," she responded, mounting with the grace that Matteo remembered from their youthful rides. "Are you coming?" Matteo mounted the second horse, and the small procession set off. He didn't need to ask the destination. He instinctively knew where they were headed. The path to the old oak at the lookout was engraved in his memory, like an indelible map. What he didn't expect was what they found upon arriving. The lookout had been transformed. Garlands of wildflowers hung from the lower branches of the oak. Small paper lanterns, which would shine when the sun began to set, were arranged along the path. And waiting, for them a small congregation, Don Emilio, the old blacksmith, Carmen, the woman from the bulletin board, Javier and his family, Mrs. Peralta, the doctor who had attended Lara at the local hospital, and a dozen other faces that Matteo recognized from the village. In the center of it all, under the oak, there was a small improvised altar, covered with a white cloth and adorned with more wildflowers. Next to it, the mayor of the village, with his official sash crossing his chest, smiled expectantly. Matteo stopped his horse, too surprised to speak. Elena stopped beside him, observing his reaction with a mixture of nervousness and hope. "Elena," he finally managed to say, "what is this?" She dismounted gracefully and approached his horse, looking up at him. "It's a second chance," she responded, "if you want it." Matteo dismounted slowly, trying to process what was happening. The villagers, the altar, Elena in her white dress. Everything pointed to a single conclusion, so unexpected and yet so perfectly fitting that it almost took his breath away. "Are you asking me?" he began, unable to complete the question. "To marry us," confirmed Elena, taking his hands in hers. "Here, today, under the same oak where we carved our names 20 years ago, on the anniversary of our last day together." She looked toward Isabel, who was observing the scene with eyes bright with emotion, and toward Lara, who smiled from the carriage with a mixture of satisfaction and tenderness. "Not to erase the past," she continued. "We can't recover the lost years, but we can honor them, learn from them, and build something new on their foundations." Matteo looked around, at the expectant faces, at the flowers, at the old oak that had been witness to so many crucial moments in their lives, and finally, at Elena, whose eyes reflected the same mixture of hope and vulnerability he felt in his own heart. "Yes," he responded simply. "Yes, Elena Montero. I will marry you today, tomorrow, and all the days we have left." A collective sigh ran through the small congregation. Isabel applauded with enthusiasm, running to embrace her parents. Lara, with Anna's help, descended from the carriage to join them. The ceremony was simple, but deeply meaningful. The mayor, with the solemnity proper to important occasions, officiated the civil marriage. Matteo and Elena exchanged vows they had written that very morning, words that spoke not of an idealized love, but of a real one, tested by time and adversity, strengthened by forgiveness and mutual understanding. Isabel held the rings, the original with the green stone that Matteo had bought for Elena so many years ago, and a new one, simple, that Elena had acquired in the capital during their stay. "With this ring," said Matteo, sliding it onto Elena's finger, "I offer you not only my love, but my understanding, my patience, my companionship in the good days and in the difficult ones. I offer you a home, not just a physical place, but a space in my heart where you will always be welcome, no matter where your path takes you." "With this ring," responded Elena, placing hers on Matteo's hand, "I offer you my love, my respect, my admiration for the man you have become. I offer you my presence, not always physical but always emotional. I offer you my commitment to build together a family, a future, a home that transcends distances and time." When the mayor declared them husband and wife, the sun was beginning to descend toward the horizon, bathing the lookout with that golden light that made everything seem more vibrant, more real, more alive. Matteo kissed Elena under the old oak, where their initials carved 20 years ago were beginning to merge with the living bark. The celebration that followed was as simple as it was genuine. They had arranged tables under the trees, covered with white tablecloths and adorned with wildflowers. The food, prepared by the women of the village, was abundant and homemade. Wine flowed in simple glasses, and the music, provided by a local trio, filled the air with traditional melodies of the valley. While the party continued around them, Matteo found a moment to approach Lara, who observed everything from a comfortable chair, her face reflecting a quiet satisfaction. "This was your idea, wasn't it?" he asked, sitting beside her. Lara smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of amusement and tenderness. "I only planted the seed," she responded. "Elena made it bloom. It was always like that between us. I suggested, she acted." Matteo took her hand, noting how the weeks of recovery had begun to restore her strength, although she was still far from her previous vitality. "Thank you," he said, and in that simple word, he tried to convey all he felt. Gratitude for her role in Isabel's life, for having kept alive the connection with Elena, for having orchestrated, in her silent but effective way, this reunion that had seemed impossible. "Don't thank me," responded Lara, gently squeezing his hand. "Just promise me you'll be happy. The three of you, the four of us, if you include me in your plans." "You will always have a place with us," affirmed Matteo. "You are as much a part of this family as any of us." The music changed then to a melody that Matteo recognized immediately. "Wind of the Valley," the song that Elena had loved in her youth, the same one he had sung at the festival, that day that seemed to mark the beginning of this new stage in their lives. Elena approached, extending her hand toward him. "Would you dance with me, husband?" she asked, and the word husband, so new on her lips, sounded like a promise and a celebration at the same time. Matteo stood, taking her hand. "Always, wife," he responded, and together they headed to the cleared space under the oak that served as an improvised dance floor. As they moved to the rhythm of the music, Matteo was aware of the eyes watching them. Isabel, radiant with happiness. Lara, with her serene smile. The villagers, some with undisguised tears of emotion. But above all, he was aware of Elena in his arms, real and present, after so many years of absence. "What are you thinking?" she asked, noticing his reflective expression. "About the paths that brought us here," he responded. "About how something that seemed like a tragedy, the storm, the flood, Lara's accident, ended up being the catalyst for this. Sometimes life needs to shake us forcefully to put us on the right path," she commented, as if the universe itself conspired to repair what was broken. They looked toward Isabel, who was now dancing with Don Emilio, laughing as the old man tried to follow the rhythm with exaggerated steps. Their daughter, thought Matteo. Their daughter, who had grown without him for 8 years, but who now formed part of his life as if she had always been there. "How will we make it work?" he asked, returning to the practical questions they would eventually have to face. "Your work, my responsibilities here." Elena looked at him with a mixture of determination and serenity. "We'll find the way," she responded. "Maybe I'll spend more time here. Maybe we'll travel together occasionally. Isabel can get to know the world beyond the valley, and you can remember that there's a life outside these forests." She paused, considering. "It won't be conventional. It won't always be easy, but it will be ours, Matteo. Our path, our family, our story." The music changed to a slower melody, and Matteo drew Elena closer, feeling the beat of her heart against his own. "Ours," he repeated, and the word contained an entire world of possibilities. As the afternoon gave way to evening, the small paper lanterns began to glow, creating a magical atmosphere at the lookout. The stars appeared one by one in the clear sky, like silent witnesses to the promises exchanged under the old oak. Isabel approached her parents, her eyes bright, reflecting the lights of the lanterns. "Does this mean we'll always be together?" she asked, with that mixture of hope and concern she occasionally showed. Elena knelt to be at her height, taking her small hands in hers. "It means we'll always be a family," she responded, "even when we're physically separated. Even when I have to travel for work or you're at school, we'll be connected by something stronger than distance or time." "Like the roots of the oak," intervened Matteo, joining them. "They extend under the ground, invisible but strong, connecting everything that grows around them." Isabel seemed satisfied with the explanation. She looked up toward the branches of the tree silhouetted against the starry sky. "I like our tree," she declared. "I like our family." The simplicity of the affirmation, The complete acceptance of this new reality deeply moved Matteo. In that moment, with his daughter and his wife beside him, under the oak that had been witness to so many crucial moments in their lives, he felt that a circle was closing. It wasn't an ending, he understood. It was a beginning, a rebirth, not just for him or for Eleanor, but for the entire valley that surrounded them, as if the earth itself celebrated this long-postponed reunion. Later, when the party began to dissolve and the guests returned to the village, Matteo, Elena, Isabel and Lara remained a moment longer under the oak. The lanterns still shone, dimmer now, and the music had reduced to a soft, distant murmur. "Look," Isabel suddenly pointed, indicating the valley that stretched at their feet. They followed her gaze and saw what had caught her attention. Along the path that descended from the lookout toward the village, small lights moved in the darkness. The neighbors, returning to their homes with lanterns and torches, formed a procession of light that wound through the landscape like a river of stars. "It's beautiful," murmured Lara, leaning on Anna's arm, who had remained to help her on the return. "It's perfect," corrected Elena, intertwining her fingers with Matteo's. And it was, he thought, not with the idealized perfection of fairy tales, but with the imperfect perfection of real life. Complex, challenging, unpredictable, but infinitely valuable, precisely because of those qualities. As they began the descent toward the cabin that was now truly a home, Matteo looked one last time at the old oak at the lookout. In the penumbra, it seemed to him that the initials carved in its bark glowed with their own light, as if the wood itself had absorbed something of the magic of this day. Past, present and future, intertwined like the roots under the ground, like the branches that extended toward the starry sky, like the paths they had traveled to find each other again in this place, in this moment, in this life they were just beginning to share.